Most players finish Bloodborne thinking they understood it, but there are layers buried so deep in item descriptions, cut content, and obscure NPC dialogue that even dedicated hunters have missed them entirely. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. I put this video together because I kept running into Bloodborne discussions online where the same surface-level facts kept getting recycled. Everyone knows about the moon presence. Everyone knows Yharnam is trapped. But there is so much underneath that. When I was assembling this, I made a deliberate choice to focus on the stuff that changes how you see the game on a second playthrough. I also chose to reorder some of the lore chronologically rather than by the order you encounter it in the game, because I think that framing makes certain connections click in a way they otherwise would not. Some things I left out entirely. I cut a long section on Chalice Dungeon lore because it deserves its own video. What you are getting here is the main game, its NPCs, its factions, and the quiet nightmare running underneath all of it. Chapter 1. The City Before the Hunt. Yharnam was not always a city of hunters. Before the workshops, before the blood ministration, before the bells and the beasts, it was a city built on faith and stone. The healing church did not exist yet. The hunters did not exist yet. What existed was a culture of people who had already stumbled onto something ancient and were doing their best not to understand it. The early Yharnamites were drawn to a specific site beneath the city, a subterranean tomb that predated any structure above it. This tomb would later be called the Pthumerian Labyrinth, but before it had a name, it had a pull. People went down into it and did not always come back the same. The Pthumerians were not human in the way the Yharnamites were human. Item descriptions suggest they were an ancient civilization that stumbled into contact with the Great Ones long before anyone in the surface world had a name for them. They built their civilization around this contact. Their queens bore the echoes of Great Ones, and their rituals were designed to sustain that connection across generations. By the time Yharnam was built above their ruins, the Pthumerians were already gone, but their blood was not. It had soaked into the stone, the water, and the air. The people above them were inheriting something they had not asked for. The old labyrinth beneath Yharnam is genuinely massive. The game gives you access to a portion of it through the chalice rituals, but the lore suggests these tunnels stretch far further than any hunter has ever mapped. The Pthumerians built these spaces as sacred sites, not dungeons. The traps and the monsters that fill them now are a kind of corruption, a gradual decay of something that was once organised and purposeful. When you descend into the chalice dungeons, you are walking through the ruins of a civilization that was consumed by the very thing it was worshipping. What makes the Pthumerians fascinating is that they succeeded in a way. They achieved contact with the Great Ones. Their queens received something like a blessing, and it destroyed them anyway. This is one of those patterns in Bloodborne that repeats across every faction in the game: the healing church, the school of Mensis, the choir, Byrgenwerth itself. Everyone who reaches far enough toward the Great Ones gets what they wanted and loses everything else. The Pthumerians are just the oldest version of that story. The blood of the Pthumerians was eventually discovered by scholars from Byrgenwerth. This is where the recorded history of Bloodborne's main narrative really begins, with a group of academics descending into the labyrinth, not out of faith, but out of intellectual hunger. They were not worshippers, they were researchers. And that distinction matters, because it shaped everything that came after. The church came from Byrgenwerth. The workshop came from the church. The entire structure of Yharnam as you experience it in the game traces back to those first scholars standing in Pthumerian ruins and deciding to take something home with them. Byrgenwerth College is never shown to you in its prime. By the time you reach it in the game, it is a crumbling building surrounded by lunatics, with Master Willem sitting catatonic in a chair overlooking a lake. But the lore pieces together a picture of what it once was. It was a place of serious academic inquiry. The scholars there were studying the nature of the cosmos, the relationship between blood and consciousness, and the ruins beneath Yharnam with genuine rigour. They had debates, they had disagreements, they published ideas. Willem himself had a philosophy about eyes and insight that he believed could expand human consciousness beyond its biological limits. The split between Willem and Lawrence is the fracture point that creates the entire world of Bloodborne. Lawrence was one of Willem's students, and at some point the two of them disagreed so fundamentally about the right way to use the old blood that Lawrence left and founded the Healing Church. Willem believed the path to ascension was through the eyes, through accumulating insight, through mental transformation. Lawrence believed it was through the blood itself. Both of them were pointing at the same destination. They just chose roads that led to very different disasters. Lawrence's founding of the Healing Church was not initially sinister. This is something the game goes out of its way to suggest through item descriptions and NPC dialogue scattered across the whole run. The early church was genuinely trying to help people. The blood ministration did work as a medical treatment. People who were sick got better. People with injuries healed faster. The church grew because it was offering something real. The corruption came later, and it came gradually, which is what makes it so unsettling. There was no single moment when the church became something evil. It drifted. The Great Ones that the Thumerians made contact with are not fully explained in the game, and that is intentional. FromSoft has always been comfortable leaving the nature of their cosmic entities vague, and Bloodborne leans into this harder than any of their other games. What we can piece together is that the Great Ones exist on a plane that overlaps with the human world without fully occupying it. They are not in the stars, they are not in another dimension. They are sort of adjacent to reality, pressing against it in ways that human beings can occasionally perceive, usually at significant cost to their sanity. The Moon Presence is the Great One most directly connected to the events of the game, but it is not the oldest or the most powerful. It is, however, the most interested in Yharnam specifically. The game suggests, and this is very much an interpretation, that the Moon Presence has been cultivating the hunt for its own purposes. Yharnam did not create the hunt out of pure altruism. He was guided. The workshop, the hunters, the whole system of the night hunt, all of it points towards something that benefits the Moon Presence in ways that are never made entirely explicit. The hunt is a ritual. It just does not look like one. Gehrman's original relationship with the Moon Presence is one of the most tragic threads in the game. He is described as the first hunter, and the implication is that he made some kind of pact that he did not fully understand. The doll was created in the image of Lady Maria, a hunter Gehrman clearly had strong feelings for, and the Moon Presence uses this somehow. The exact mechanics are left vague, but the emotional core is clear. Gehrman is a prisoner who does not always recognise his cage. He has been there long enough to half forget there was anything else. Maria herself is a fascinating figure because she represents a kind of conscience that the hunter world mostly lacks. She was a student of Gehrman, a Canehurst noble who joined the hunt and eventually became deeply involved in the fishing hamlet experiments. When she discovered what was being done to the people of the hamlet, she buried her weapon in the research hall and refused to continue. She is one of the very few figures in the game's history who encountered the horror of what the church was doing and chose to stop participating, even if she could not undo the damage. The fishing hamlet is one of those locations that does not get enough attention in surface-level discussions. It is presented as late-game content, a hidden village of hostile fishermen, but the lore underneath it is extraordinary. The people of the hamlet had contact with a Great One, not through blood, not through ritual, but through genuine coexistence. A Great One had washed ashore, or perhaps had always been there in some form, and the hamlet had built a relationship with it. This is almost unique in the game. Almost everyone else who touches the Great Ones ends up consumed or destroyed. The hamlet found something closer to equilibrium. Then the church arrived, The scholars from Bergenworth, and later the church's own researchers, came to the hamlet not to observe or to coexist, but to extract. They wanted the source of what the hamlet had. They took the eyes of the Great One. They conducted experiments on the villagers. They did this systematically and without apparent remorse. Lady Maria participated in this, and later could not forgive herself for it. The hamlet itself was left broken. The surviving villagers became something between human and not, hostile to everyone, forever marked by what was done to them. The item called the milkweed rune, which you find in the research hall, transforms the player into something resembling a lumenwood. This is connected to the experiments conducted on the patients of the research hall, many of whom were drawn from vulnerable populations and subjected to procedures designed to force contact with the Great Ones. The church framed this as treatment. The patients were told they were being healed. What was actually happening to them was something else entirely, something that the game shows you in the form of the enemies you fight in that location. The research hall itself was run by Lawrence's successors within the church, particularly a faction called the Choir. The choir occupied the upper cathedral ward and was distinct from the regular healing church clergy, in that they were explicitly pursuing transcendence rather than just healing. They had gone further than Lawrence intended. They were administering the eyes of the Great One to patients in the research hall in an attempt to induce a kind of forced enlightenment. The results were the creatures you encounter there. Things that are partway through a transformation that has gone catastrophically wrong. The living failures are what happened to the patients who almost made it. They were subjects who received the celestial treatment, who began transforming towards something higher, but never completed the process. They are not quite beasts. They are not quite Great Ones. They exist in a permanent state of incomplete becoming, and the game positions them as a boss encounter you have to clear before reaching Lady Maria, which feels thematically deliberate. Maria is the gatekeeper of the hamlet's secret, and the living failures are the evidence of what the church did to try to reach that secret. Ebrietas, daughter of the cosmos, is a Great One who was left behind. The game describes her as having been found in the Thumerian ruins, and essentially adopted by the choir, who built the altar of despair specifically to house and commune with her. She is unique among the Great Ones, in that she seems to have chosen to remain. Or at least she did not leave when she could have. Whether this represents affection, grief, or something too alien to categorize is genuinely unclear. She is one of the most visually striking boss encounters in the game, partly because she feels lost in a way that most cosmic entities do not. The choir's ultimate goal, as best the lore suggests, was to use Ebrietas as a bridge. They wanted to contact the Great Ones in a controlled, sustained way, rather than the sporadic, individual contact that the blood ministration produced. Ebrietas was supposed to be a telephone line to something beyond. Whether this ever worked in any meaningful sense is not made clear. What is clear is that the choir was still at it when the night of the hunt began, and that their work did not save them any more than anyone else's work saved them. The beast plague that drives the surface narrative of the game is not a random outbreak. This is something the lore is quite pointed about, even if it never states it directly. The plague is a consequence. The blood ministration introduced something into Yharnam's population that was always going to do this eventually. The old blood is not inert medicine, it is active. It changes the people who use it, and the direction of that change toward the beast is built into what the blood fundamentally is. The church knew this on some level. The hunters existed precisely because someone had to manage what the blood eventually did to people. This is what makes the hunter vocation so dark when you look at it clearly. The church created the blood ministration. The blood ministration created the beast plague. The hunters were created to kill the beasts. The church is funding and operating all three stages of this cycle. The hunters are not an independent check on the church's excesses. They are a component of the same system. When you play through the game as a hunter, You are participating in an institution designed to manage a catastrophe that its own founders engineered. The old hunters, the ones from the era of the workshop, operated under a slightly different arrangement. The workshop predates the Healing Church's full consolidation of power, and the hunters of that era had more independence, more individual character, more moral complexity. The Crow of Canehurst, the Ashen Blood Hunting Party, the people whose equipment you find scattered through the world. These were figures who made their own choices, for better or worse, within a system that had not yet fully calcified into the corrupt institution you encounter at the game's start. The fall of the workshop is another one of those events that the game implies rather than shows. At some point, the Healing Church moved to consolidate control over the hunter vocation. The workshop was abandoned. Gehrman retreated to the hunter's dream. The authority over what hunters did and how they operated shifted to the church. The tools and weapons of the old workshop became relics, found and repaired by the handful of hunters who still operated outside full church sanction. This shift is part of why the game feels like it is taking place in a world after the interesting part of history already happened. The Canehurst Vilebloods are a faction that gets positioned as villains by the church, but the actual lore is significantly more complicated. Canehurst was an aristocracy that possessed a different strain of blood from the one the church was using. Their blood was called Vileblood, but the game never fully explains why, other than that the church said so. The Vileblood Queen, Annalise, is still alive when you find her, technically unkillable, sitting on a throne in a castle full of the corpses of everyone who lived there. She is one of the most melancholy figures in the game. Alfred, the hunter you meet early in the game, has dedicated his life to destroying the Vilebloods. He follows the old hunter Logarius, who you find as a boss guarding Canehurst Castle. Logarius himself turns out to be a fascinating figure, because the lore suggests he was not simply a fanatic. He sealed himself at Canehurst, holding down the secret of what was inside, which included Annalise. He was using his own life as a lock. When you kill him and take his crown, you are not defeating a villain. You are removing a cork from a bottle, and the consequences of that are part of what Alfred's questline explores. Alfred's ending, if you let it run to completion, is disturbing in the specific way that Bloodborne is disturbing. He is not corrupted by the blood. He does not turn into a beast. He simply executes his mission, kills the unkillable queen by tearing her apart, and then sits down on her throne and laughs. There is nothing cosmic about his horror. He accomplished what he set out to do, and it turns out that his purpose was the only thing holding him together. Without it, there is nothing left. The game uses him to make a point about what happens when devotion fills the space where a self should be. The Iosefka's clinic questline is one of the most disturbing things in the game if you follow it carefully. The real Iosefka gets displaced early on by an imposter, a church researcher who uses the clinic as a cover to conduct experiments. If you keep sending survivors to her clinic, they get turned into celestial beings, the blue jellyfish creatures called celestial emissaries. She is conducting her own transcendence experiments right there in the opening area of the game, behind a locked door, while everything else is burning. She is killed by the time you can reach her, but the trail of what she was doing is laid out clearly enough. The celestial emissaries themselves are interesting, because they represent a kind of ascension that did not go catastrophically wrong, or at least not as catastrophically as the research hall patients. They are alien, they are changed beyond recognition, but they are not clearly suffering in the way the living failures are. The game leaves deliberately ambiguous whether becoming a celestial emissary is a tragedy or a transformation. Given that the church considers it a positive outcome, and given the church's track record, you are probably right to be skeptical. But the ambiguity is genuine. The Plain Doll is the most emotionally complex character in the game, and also the one who speaks the least. She exists in the hunter's dream, created by Gehrman, animated by something the game does not name. She was made in the image of Lady Maria, which the game lets you discover rather than states directly. She does not know what she is. She experiences something she calls cold and lonely when the hunter's dream is empty. She wonders what it means that she can feel at all. She is not a great one. She is not human. She is a created thing, asking real questions about her own existence, and the game gives her no answers. The doll leveling you up is mechanically necessary, but also thematically loaded. You are bringing her echoes, the remnants of the people you killed, and she is using them to make you stronger. What does she think about this? The game never says. She is warm toward the player in a way that feels genuine rather than programmed, but her warmth is also built into her by a man who is himself a prisoner. Everything about her situation is sad in ways she cannot fully articulate, and you cannot fully explain to her. Gehrman's offer at the end of the game, to free you from the dream by killing you, is presented as a mercy, and genuinely is one. By the time you reach him, you understand enough to know that being in the hunter's dream is not a neutral state. It is a form of captivity. He is offering you the best exit available. The fact that you can refuse and fight him, and the fact that the moon presence then intervenes if you do, reveals the actual stakes underneath the mercy. Gehrman's offer is real, but it is also the only outcome the moon presence prepared for. Anything else requires you to break a system that was not designed to be broken. The three endings of the game map onto three different relationships with the knowledge you have accumulated over the course of the night. Leaving the dream is accepting the limits of what you can know and choosing to live within them. Becoming the new Gehrman is accepting the system and stepping into its maintenance. And the third ending, where the doll cradles an infant great one, suggests something stranger, that the player character has transformed into something new rather than being subsumed into something old. Which of these is good? The game has no interest in answering that cleanly. Simon the Harrowed is an NPC found in the Delk who came to Yharnam as a researcher rather than a fighter. He picked up a weapon out of necessity, not vocation. He is genuinely uncomfortable with violence in a way that most hunters are not, and he represents a path that Bloodborne mostly does not take. Someone who wandered into this nightmare by accident and is doing their honest best to get through it. He found the hamlet and was appalled by what he saw there. His questline ends with him dying from his wounds, having gathered enough evidence to know the truth about what the church did, which he cannot share with anyone because there is no one left to share it with. The damp blood gem mechanic and the rune system in the game encode lore in ways that most players never decode. The runes are described as the language of the Great Ones, transcribed by Carol, a student of Bergenworth. She did not invent them. She listened to the sounds of a Great One and tried to translate them into something human minds could use. The resulting runes, when inscribed in the mind, produce real effects. This is the game's most explicit statement that the Great Ones communicate in ways that bypass language and go straight to consciousness. Carol was not a scholar of alien linguistics. She was a receiver picking up a signal she did not fully understand. The lore of the powder kegs, the faction responsible for the more explosively creative hunter weapons, is mostly comedic in tone, but has a dark underside. They were expelled from the workshop for being too dangerous, which in the context of the workshop is a significant achievement. The powder kegs believed that conventional hunter tools were insufficient for the scale of the problem, and that more extreme measures were warranted. They were not wrong. Exactly. The church considered them embarrassing. The game leaves them as a background detail, but their weapons, the ones you find scattered around the world, are some of the most interesting in the game. The old hunters whose equipment you collect throughout the main game were real people. The Gehrman set, the Simon set, the Maria set. These are not anonymous drops. They are the remaining physical traces of specific individuals who lived and fought and died in a world that was already beginning to come apart. Finding Maria's armor in the research hall, after learning what she did and why she stopped, is one of those moments where the game's lore and its item design work together with unusual elegance. The armor tells you she was there. The lore tells you what that cost her. The Hunter's Nightmare, the DLC's main location, is not a metaphor. It is a literal place where the worst hunters, the ones who went too far, were trapped after death. Brador is the most explicit example, a church assassin who murdered other hunters to protect the church's secrets, imprisoned in his own cell by his own chains, sending bloodletting beasts after you to protect a secret he himself is not sure is worth protecting anymore. He has been there long enough to lose almost everything except the reflex to keep doing what he was trained to do. Lawrence's skull, which you find early in the Delk and then encounter as a boss, is one of the most conceptually interesting things in the game. Lawrence, the founder of the Healing Church, the man who broke from Willem to pursue the blood, ended up becoming a beast in the nightmare. His human skull sits in the waking world as a relic. His beast self burns eternally in the dream. He achieved everything he wanted and became the thing he built an entire institution to destroy. The fight against him is not triumphant. It is just very, very sad. The relationship between blood and memory is something the game touches on repeatedly without ever making into an explicit thesis. The echoes you collect are the lingering energy of dead things. The blood you use is not just a biological substance, but a carrier of something more than biology. When Adeline in the research hall asks you for brain fluid, and you keep giving it to her, she transforms and eventually gives you a rune. She has ingested enough of something that she achieved a kind of contact that the formal church experiments could not. She did it by accident, or by instinct, and the game offers this as a quiet counterpoint to the systematic horror happening around her. The Nightmare Frontier and the Nightmare of Mensis are two different nightmare spaces that the game distinguishes through texture and population. The Frontier is a kind of limbo, a place that collects things that have nowhere else to be. The Mensis Nightmare is more deliberate, a space that the School of Mensis actively opened and then could not close. The Brain of Mensis, that enormous pulsing thing you have to drop into a pit before you can safely continue, is what happened to the scholars who went too deep. They reached contact. The contact hollowed them out, and what was left over coalesced into that. The bodies hanging in the iron cage below it used to be people. Mikolash is the head of the School of Mensis and one of the stranger bosses in the game. He runs from you. He talks constantly. He is clearly not entirely sane by the time you catch him, but his dialogue is not random. He is asking Kos, or some say Cosm, for eyes on the inside. He wants insight in the most literal sense possible. He wants to see. He achieved enough contact with the Great Ones to understand that there is something worth seeing, and he sacrificed his students and his mind and his body to keep reaching for it. He dies with the words of his prayer still on his lips, which is either pathetic or faithful, depending on how you choose to read it. Chapter 2. What the Blood Remembers. The blood used in the Healing Church's ministrations did not originate from a single source. This is something the game implies through the different types of bloodstone gems, the various Carol runes associated with blood, and the conflicting descriptions of what the blood actually does in different contexts. There seem to have been at least two distinct lineages of old blood in use: the Tumerian strain discovered in the Labyrinth, and something derived more directly from Great One contact through Bjergenworth. The Church blended these in ways it did not fully understand, and the results were neither uniform nor predictable. The bloodletting beast found in the Chalice dungeons suggests that the corruption of the old blood does not produce the same results at every level. The surface beasts, the ones you fight in Yharnam streets, are products of a relatively dilute contact with the blood. The deeper you go into the chalices, the more advanced and alien the corruption becomes. The bloodletting beast has had its head replaced entirely with something else. This is not a feature of ordinary beast transformation. This is something the deep blood does that the surface blood does not, and the game never explains the mechanism, it just shows you the result. The amygdalae are everywhere in Yharnam, attached to buildings, clinging to the cathedral, present in spaces that most players simply never look up to notice. For most of the game, they are invisible to the player, unless they have accumulated enough insight. This is the most elegant expression of the game's core mechanic, that the more you know, the more of the horror you can see. But the amygdalae are not predatory by default. They are using their claws to transport people with sufficient insight to specific locations. The one at the top of the cathedral ward is your only way into the lecture building. They are part of a system of transit that the Great Ones seem to have established for reasons that are not made explicit. The lecture building itself is an anomaly in the game's geography. It does not connect logically to the spaces around it. You enter it from an amygdala transport and find yourself in a school that appears to be floating somewhere between the waking world and the nightmare. The lecture notes scattered around it describe a curriculum, courses on blood, on the Great Ones, on the nature of the hunt. The students who attended those lectures are now crawling things in the hallways. The implication is that the lecture building was a kind of bridge institution between Bergenworth's academic tradition and the nightmare spaces that the most advanced research opened up. Rom, the vacuous spider, is a former Bergenworth scholar who underwent the forbidden ritual and became a Great One, or something adjacent to one. She is called vacuous, empty, and her fight is strange, because she is not aggressive by default. She is maintaining a veil. As long as Rom lives, certain truths about the waking world are hidden. The winter lanterns in the nightmare spaces carry her eyes, and her transformation from scholar to spider to cosmic veil keeper is one of the most quietly devastating arcs in the game. She did not choose to become what she is. She was transformed by knowledge she was not equipped to survive. The celestial children found near the Orphan of Kos are some of the most unusual enemies in the game because they do not attack you unless provoked. They are sitting near the body of a dead Great One, gathered in a kind of vigil, and they carry small parasites that they will throw if you bother them. These children, and the game is not subtle about the word, seem to be connected to Kos in some reproductive or generative way. The Great Ones seek to create, to propagate, and the children around Kos suggest that she was in some process of doing exactly that when she was found by the Bergenworth scholars and her eyes were taken. The Orphan of Kos is not a monster in the traditional sense. It is a newborn. Its weapon is the placenta of its own birth. It came into the world to find its parent already dead on the shore, surrounded by the ruins of a hamlet that had been destroyed by the people who killed her. Its screaming is not the screaming of a beast. It is the screaming of something just born into grief. The game frames this as a boss fight and you have to win it. But if you pay attention to what you are actually doing, you are killing a child that never had a chance to be anything else. The curse at the end of the Dilk, spoken by the ghost of Kos, is one of the most emotionally direct pieces of dialogue in the game. It does not threaten. It does not roar. It says that the nightmare was born from their greed, and that hunters will be cursed to the hunter's nightmare. The pronoun is ambiguous. All hunters? The Bergenworth hunters specifically? You, the player, as an inheritor of the hunter tradition? The game does not clarify, and that ambiguity is the point. The curse is real, and it has already happened, and you are living in the consequences whether you did anything to deserve them or not. The Kos parasite, the weapon you receive after defeating the orphan, is a tentacle that you swing as a whip. If you wear the milkweed rune, it changes behaviour and shoots projectiles instead. This is an absurd weapon on the surface, but the lore underneath it is dense. You are wielding a parasite from a dead Great One. The milkweed rune transforms you into something resembling a lumenwood, the plant creatures from the research hall experiments. The combination suggests you are becoming a host for something that was Koss's. The game does not editorialize, it just gives you the option. The Hunter's Mark, the item you use to return to the Hunter's Dream from anywhere in the waking world, is described as having been imprinted on hunters through some connection to the dream. This is mechanical convenience in game terms, but it points towards something important in the lore. The hunters do not return to the dream by magic or by will. They return because something calls them. The mark is a leash, as much as it is a lifeline. Every time you wake up at a lamp, you are being recalled by the system you are embedded in. And the fact that this feels like a convenience rather than a constraint is part of what the game is doing. Blood echoes, the currency of the game, are the lingering energy of the dead. When enemies drop echoes, they are releasing something that was collected in their blood during life. When you die and your echoes are left behind in the world, it is because something that was you is still there, waiting, bleeding. The game's death mechanic is not just a punishment, it is a statement about what the blood holds and what it costs to lose it. The hunter who runs back to recover their echoes is running back to recover something that is genuinely part of themselves in the game's cosmology. The insight system is the most direct representation of the game's central theme in mechanical form. You gain insight by discovering new areas, by encountering great ones, by using certain items, and you spend it to unlock certain options. High insight changes the waking world in observable ways. The celestial mob appears. The sound design shifts. Enemies behave differently. The game is modelling the idea that knowledge changes perception, that the more you know about the truth of Yharnam, the more of that truth you are forced to see. This is not a comfortable process. The things that become visible at high insight are not pleasant. Dura, the retired hunter in Old Yharnam, is one of the most morally complex NPCs in the game, precisely because his position is the most defensible. He has stopped hunting. He sits atop a Gatling gun and uses it to protect the beasts below him, because he has decided that the beasts are still people and that killing them is wrong. The game lets you either kill him or talk him down by approaching in a specific way. If you earn his trust, he gives you the powder keg badge and a gesture, and tells you he wants to be left alone. He is not insane. He just reached a conclusion that the hunter system does not have room for. The beast of Old Yharnam, Dark Beast Paarl, is one of the oldest transformed beasts in the game, so old and so deep in the corruption that it has become something between beast and lightning. The implication of certain item descriptions is that the progression of beast transformation does not stop at the recognizable animal stages. Given enough time and enough blood, the beast becomes something elemental, something that has moved so far from its human origin that the original human nature is only visible as a faint echo in its behavior. Paarl is not aggressive by default in the Chalice dungeon version, which might mean something. The connection between the beast plague and the moon is gestured at throughout the game, but never made explicit. The hunt happens at night. The blood moon appears as the game progresses toward its endgame. The moon presence is connected to both the dream and the hunt. The traditional folkloric association between the full moon and bestial transformation is clearly a reference point, but Bloodborne is doing something more specific with it. The blood moon is not just symbolic, it represents an actual change in the relationship between the Great Ones and the waking world, a thinning of whatever barrier usually exists between those planes. The Witches of Hemwick are a boss fight that the game drops you into with almost no contextual setup, but the lore is interesting. The rune workshop tool is in their area, which allowed hunters to inscribe runes into themselves. The witches are old women who can summon invisible eyes, actual physical eyeballs that attack you. This ties them to the insight and vision themes the game runs throughout. They were practitioners of something adjacent to what Byrgenwerth was doing. A folk magic tradition of sight and blood that predates the formal institutions. They are another thread of the same cultural fabric, older and less organised. The patch's connection across FromSoft games is well known to fans, but in Bloodborne he appears as Patches the Spider, a half-transformed creature in the Nightmare Frontier. He is friendly by default, which is unusual for him, and he sells items. The transformation in his body is visually arresting, but his personality remains recognizable. He is pragmatic. He is self-interested. He found a way to survive in the nightmare by being useful and non-threatening. The game uses him for a small joke in the context of the nightmare, but also to suggest that personality can survive transformation in ways that the Beast Plague usually does not allow. The Nightmare Frontier is populated with amygdalae that are aggressive, unlike the ones in the waking world. This distinction suggests that the nightmares operate under different rules than the waking city. The same entities that function as transportation infrastructure in Yharnam become hostile in the nightmare spaces. Whether this represents the Great One's actual relationship with the nightmare, or just a difference in context, is unclear. But it contributes to the sense that the nightmares are not spaces where any normal logic applies. The item called the Small Resonant Bell and the Beckoning Bell open the game's multiplayer system, but they are also lore objects. Ringing the resonant bell summons hunters from other worlds. The lore suggests this is not a technical system, but a genuine cosmic mechanic. That hunters exist in multiple simultaneous versions of the same night, bleeding across each other's realities when the bells are rung. The sinister resonant bell, used by NPC invaders, is described as a tool of hunting hunters, which is a recursive and slightly vertiginous idea in the context of everything else. The church giants, the giant automatons in the cathedral ward and beyond, are constructs built by the church, but their lore is mostly absent. They are maintenance workers who outlived the people who made them. They sweep and tend without purpose. This is one of those small background details that contributes to the overall atmosphere without requiring explication. The church built things that keep running after there is nothing left to maintain. Everything the church made outlasts its purpose. The Cainhurst letter, which summons you to the castle, is one of the more elegant pieces of world building in the game. You find it delivered to Iosefka's clinic at the start, addressed to qualified hunters. The Vile Bloods want hunters to come because they want to accumulate echoes. The entire Cainhurst questline begins with a piece of correspondence that turns out to have a completely different agenda than it appears to. The castle is not what the letter promises. The Queen is not what you expect. The story of Cainhurst is a story about aristocracy preserving itself by adaptation rather than resistance. The beast claws, found in the Chalice dungeons, belonged to a hunter who had already transformed partway into a beast, but chose to continue using that transformation as a weapon. The gesture attached to them has the character drop to all fours and howl. This is not presented as a tragedy in the weapon description. It is presented as a choice. The game contains multiple paths toward what the world would consider corruption, that are framed as things individuals decided to pursue rather than things that happen to them against their will. The beast claws are one of the more explicit examples. Simon's bowblade, which you can get from the Harrowed Hunter, is interesting both as a weapon and as a character artifact. Simon came to Yharnam as a scholar, reluctantly armed himself, and his weapon reflects that ambivalence. It is a bow that converts to a blade, a range weapon that only becomes close quarters when absolutely necessary. It is the weapon of someone who never wanted to be in combat, shaped by the conditions of a world where that preference was a liability. He carried it all the way to the hamlet, and it could not save him when it mattered. The living string, a material dropped by the brain of Mensis and used in certain chalice rituals, is described as the greatest of all discoveries in the early days of contact with the Great Ones. It is a piece of the nervous system of something too large to comprehend. The fact that it is a crafting material in a game filled with dozens of crafting materials means most players never stop to read its description carefully, but it is pointing at something that the game keeps circling back to, that the Great Ones have physical reality, and that their physical reality can be harvested, which is part of what the fishing hamlet was about in the first place. The Murgo's wet nurse is the boss guarding Murgo, the infant Great One who is crying in the Mensis nightmare. The wet nurse is one of the most visually strange things in the game, a thing of layered fabric and shadow that splits into multiples during the fight. It is a guardian, a hired protector. Someone or something hired it or created it to protect the infant. The infant cannot protect itself. Killing the wet nurse and stopping Murgo's cries is framed in the game as something that benefits the moon presence. It is an act of cosmic politics that the player performs without fully understanding the stakes. The formula for the Old Blood, or rather the decision about which version of the Old Blood to use, was one of the central debates at Byrgenwerth. Different scholars had different ideas about what the blood should be, where it should come from, and what effects it was acceptable to tolerate in exchange for its benefits. Lawrence's decision to prioritize the blood as a healing substance meant accepting certain risks that other scholars wanted to quarantine first. He believed the benefits outweighed the risks. He was wrong. The entire city of Yharnam is the result of that calculation failing over the course of decades. The cleric beast is the first boss in the game, and also a conceptual demonstration. It is a massive, deformed creature on a bridge, and nothing in the game tells you who it used to be. The name suggests it was a member of the church clergy. The scale of its transformation suggests it was either exposed to an extreme amount of blood, or it was already susceptible in some particular way. The game drops you in front of it, without context, as a kind of thesis statement. Whatever this thing was, this is what happens. Everything that follows is elaboration. Father Gascoigne is the second boss, and the one that teaches you the most about how the game works emotionally. He is not a monster. He is a hunter who lost himself, who went too far into the blood, whose wife rang a music box to remind him of who he was, and who could no longer respond to that reminder by the time you encounter him. His daughter is in the area before him, asking you to find her parents. His wife is dead before you fight him. The music box he gives you is the same one his daughter has been waiting for him to bring back. This is not a puzzle with a solution. It is a loss with a timeline. Henrik, Gascoigne's old hunting partner, who you may end up fighting at the request of the Forbidden Woods NPC questline, is another example of a hunter who stayed too long. He is dangerous not because he is transformed, but because he is still himself, still competent, still wearing his hunter's garb. He just has nowhere to go. He and Gascoigne hunted together for years. Gascoigne is dead by the time Henrik becomes relevant. The game uses him to show that the blood is not the only thing that can undo a hunter. Outliving your purpose is its own kind of transformation. The Nightmare Apostle enemies found in the Nightmare of Mensis are ordinary Yharnam women who have been transformed into something adjacent to the spider form. The connection between these enemies and Rom, who achieved the full version of that transformation, is visually legible. These are the intermediate stages of something. They did not all choose it. Some of them came to Mensis as willing participants in the research. Others might have been subjects without consent. The nightmare does not distinguish between the two categories in how it treats them. Logarius's wheel, the weapon used by the choir executioners, encodes a specific theology in its moveset. The spinning wheel is described in religious terms as a prayer and as a punishment. The choir's executioners used it as an instrument of divine judgment, and the way it works in gameplay, building up arcane damage through spinning, charges and releases, does feel like a ritual with a resolution. It is one of the game's more thematically integrated weapon designs, where the mechanical feel of the weapon matches what the lore says it is. The connection between the Odon Writhe rune and the character of Odon, the Great One who exists only as a voice, is one of the more subtle lore threads. Odon is present in the game through his chapel, his followers, and his children, of whom there appear to be several. He communicated with humans. He reproduced with humans. He did this through means the game is deliberately obscure about. The implication is that Aiden's formless nature, he has no body, means he exists entirely in sound and breath, and that his reproduction happened through voice, rather than any physical contact. This is horrifying in a way that the game underplays consistently. The Orphan of Odin questline is delivered through two NPCs, the young woman in the sewers and the one in the cathedral ward, who both carry children they describe as gifts from Odin. Neither of them understands what happened to them. Both of them are grateful. The game presents their situation with almost no editorializing, which is part of what makes it so unsettling. There is no dramatic music cue, no NPC telling you this is wrong. The wrongness is there if you put the pieces together yourself, which is how the game operates throughout. The Forbidden Woods connects the city of Yharnam to a village that was conducting its own blood experiments outside church sanction. The snake-infested enemies in the woods suggest that the experiments there produced results different from the beast plague. A different kind of mutation, more parasitic than transformative. The windmill and the manor at the centre of the area belonged to someone who had access to the church's resources but was operating independently, using them for purposes the church either did not know about or chose not to acknowledge. Brador's set, which you collect piece by piece as you fight the bell-bearing hunter versions he sends after you, is one of the most expensive pieces of lore to acquire in the game because of how the system works. Each piece of his armour requires you to defeat a hunter he dispatches. The descriptions of his armour and his weapon, the bloodletting beast head flail, tell a story about a man who was the church's secret weapon, a hunter of hunters, and who eventually imprisoned himself as a kind of penance or defeat. He sends hunters after you even in his cell. He cannot stop being what the church made him. The Executioner armour set, worn by Alfred and associated with the Logarius faction, is described in terms that frame execution as a mercy. The executioners believed they were releasing people from the curse of the vile blood. They were systematic and organised, and completely sincere in their belief that what they were doing was compassionate. The church backed them. The Vilebloods were legally their targets. The fact that the Vilebloods were not actually doing what the church accused them of doing is a detail that the executioners either did not know or did not consider relevant. The chalice glyphs, the codes that allow players to share their chalice dungeons with each other, are an external mechanic that the lore does not address. But they gesture towards something interesting about how the game's community builds its own relationship with the underground content. The chalice dungeons were supposed to be the game's infinite replayable space, endlessly generated, different each time, containing rare materials and bosses. The community turned them into a shared archive. The glyphs are not lore, but they are a layer of collective meaning laid over the top of a space that the game's lore treats as sacred and secret. Chapter 3: The Shapes of Ascension. The Great Ones are not a unified group. This is something the game implies through the diversity of their appearances, their apparent goals, and the conflicts between the factions that serve them. Rom serves no one consciously, but maintains a veil. Ebrietas stayed behind when she could have left. The Moon Presence operates through proxies and management. Kos was the victim of other beings' ambitions. These are not entities with a shared agenda. They are individuals, or something like individuals, and their relationships with each other are as complicated as their relationships with the humans who worship them. The sky in the hunter's dream is wrong. This is one of those things you might notice without registering on a first playthrough. The constellations are not earthly constellations. The light is wrong. The dream exists somewhere that is not the waking world and not the nightmare, a third space that the Moon Presence maintains and that Gehrman inhabits. When you look up in the dream, you are looking at a sky that belongs to no place you will ever visit. The garden is peaceful. The sky is alien. The dream is a beautiful cage with the truth visible above it, if you know how to look. The transformation from human to great one, as the lore describes it, requires an accumulation of insight that eventually exceeds what a human mind can hold while remaining human. This is the path that Byrgenwerth's scholars were researching, and it is the path that led to Rom. It is also the path the game's third ending suggests the player character walks. The transformation does not preserve the person inside the new form, or at least it is not guaranteed to. Rom is described as vacuous, empty. The process of becoming does not include a guarantee that what you become retains what you were. The lumenwood is a plant organism that appears in the research hall and in the DLC, connected to the experiments conducted on patients who received treatment aimed at forcing celestial contact. The lumenwood kin enemies, which are the plant creatures in the Nightmare of Mensis, suggest that the transformation can go in a botanical direction as well as the more animal directions the beast plague takes. This is another example of the game suggesting that the blood does not produce uniform results, that the direction of transformation depends on factors that are not fully enumerated. The Bloodborne wiki community has collectively mapped the relative timeline of the game's events through a process of cross-referencing item descriptions that took years to complete. The game never gives you a timeline. It gives you objects with dates and relationships, and the reconstruction of what happened when is an act of collaborative interpretation. This is unusual for lore delivery in games and reflects a design philosophy about what kind of engagement the game rewards. The people who know the most about Bloodborne are the ones who read the most carefully and talk to each other about what they found. The Hunter's Axe is one of the starting weapons, and also one of the most historically significant in the game's internal history. It is described as having a long tradition among hunters, predating the more specialised weapons that came later. When you use the Hunter's Axe, you are using a tool that connects you to the earliest period of the hunt, before the workshop refined and elaborated the hunter's arsenal. This is not meaningful in gameplay terms, but it is a way the game layers meaning onto its most functional objects. The Holy Moonlight Sword, which appears in FromSoft games across multiple entries, is in Bloodborne connected directly to Ludwig, the first church hunter. Ludwig was the founder of the Healing Church's official hunter's workshop, the successor to the original hunter establishment. He fell into the nightmare and became the beast you fight at the start of the Dilk. His connection to the Holy Moonlight Sword suggests that the weapon carries something of whoever wields it, and that Ludwig's fall into the nightmare did not fully sever his connection to what he was. He remembers the sword at the end of the fight, and in that memory he recovers a fragment of his human self. The interaction between the player and Ludwig at the end of his boss fight is one of the most emotionally precise moments in the game. He is defeated, his beast form is dying, his head has been severed and is lying on the ground, and he looks at you with his one remaining eye and asks if you are a hunter of the church, if the church hunters are still in the waking world, if the hunt goes on. He wants to know if what he built survived. The correct response, the one that lets him die with dignity, is to lie. You tell him yes, the hunt goes on, the church hunters are out there. He says that it is good and dies with a smile. The truth would have given him nothing. The Bloodborne DLC, The Old Hunters, was released approximately a year after the base game and is broadly considered to expand the game's emotional and thematic range significantly. It introduces more fully developed NPC questlines, more context for the base game's history, and a location, the Hunter's Nightmare, that recontextualizes the nature of the hunt in the main game. It also substantially raises the difficulty curve in ways that the community had mixed feelings about. As a piece of lore delivery, it is the most concentrated dose of the game's themes in the smallest space. The item descriptions in Bloodborne average about 60 words each. This is the most important fact about the game's lore delivery. FromSoft has been using item descriptions as lore vehicles since Demon's Souls, but in Bloodborne, the density and precision of the descriptions is at a peak. Every word is load-bearing. The word choices are deliberate. When a description says a thing suggests something, it is not being imprecise. It is being accurate about the epistemic status of the claim it is making. The game's lore is written in a language of uncertainty because the events it describes were never fully understood by anyone who lived through them. The pungent blood cocktail, a throwable item that attracts beasts with the smell of blood, is a comedy item in the early game and a window into the beast transformation in the late game. Beasts are not driven purely by aggression. They are driven by the blood. They cannot help themselves. The people who became beasts did not choose to be drawn by that smell. The transformation changed their desires at a biological level. The cocktail weaponizes this, which is practical, and also illustrative of what happened to the people the church treated. The various blood vial types scattered through the game imply that the healing church had an entire industry around blood production and distribution. This was not informal. It was institutional. The church ran facilities. It employed people. It had supply chains. The blood ministration was not a secret ritual practiced in the shadows. It was public medicine, available to all of Yharnam, marketed as a miracle. The infrastructure required to maintain that scale of distribution was significant, and the collapse of that infrastructure when the plague hit was part of what made the night so total. The city was dependent on the thing that destroyed it. The implication in the lore that some hunters deliberately sought out beast transformation as a power source, not as an accident or a failure, is one of the more disturbing threads the game leaves largely unexplored. The beast claws, the beast's embrace rune, the Eshan blood questline material, all of these point toward a tradition within the hunter community of using the beast not as an enemy to be destroyed, but as a resource to be managed and selectively deployed. The church suppressed this approach. The suppression was not total. The 3 umbilical cords required for the third ending are one of the game's most demanding secret systems. You have to find 4, consume 3, and refuse Gehrman's offer while having done so. Each cord is described as a thing that once connected a Great One to something else. They are relics of births. The act of consuming them is the act of internalizing something of the Great One relationship those births represent. The third ending is triggered by having done this and refusing the system's normal exit. You are not ascending because the game lets you. You are ascending because you prepared in ways the system did not expect. The One Reborn, the boss of the Mensis Nightmare's outer section, is a congregation of corpses held together by ritual. The Mensis scholars built it. It is a collective body, many people fused into one thing, used as a gateway object to attract the attention of a Great One. The ritual that created it is called out in the game as the ritual the School of Mensis used to open the nightmare in the first place. They made a body big enough to get noticed. They got noticed. The nightmare they opened consumed them and created the hunter's nightmare as a side effect. The One Reborn is both the tool and the evidence of a catastrophe. The Mensis cage worn by Mikolash and some of the other scholars is a ritual object designed to draw Great One attention through the iron shape on the head. The idea is that the Great Ones can sense the shape of a human mind and that the cage amplifies or directs that signal. Whether the cage works is unclear. The scholars wearing it ended up as the enemies you fight in the nightmare, which does not suggest the experiment was a success in any straightforward sense. But Mikolash's continued clarity, his ability to quote his prayers and run and hide and beg for eyes, suggests that the cage may have done something for him, even if not what was intended. The connection between the Bloodborne world and the physical world is intentionally ambiguous. The game is not set in any real location, but it draws extensively on Victorian architecture, the geography of real Gothic cities, and specific historical moments in European medicine and religion. The healing church parallels real debates about faith versus science. The beast plague parallels real discussions about contagion and quarantine. The hunter as an institution parallels real historical mechanisms of social control dressed in the language of protection. These parallels are not one-to-one, and the game is not allegory, but the resonances are intentional, and they make the horror more grounded than purely fantastical. The Hunter's Dream Workshop table, where you use bloodstone shards to upgrade weapons, has a specific name in the lore: the Workshop of the Old Hunters. Yharnam built it. The tools there are his. When you upgrade your weapons at that table, you are using the workspace of the first hunter, the man who built the entire institution of the hunt, and then became its prisoner. There is something quietly ironic about using a prisoner's workshop to become more effective at participating in his prison. The madman's knowledge items, the floating skulls full of insight that you consume for points, are described as the solidified knowledge of scholars who went insane. Their insight literally crystallized when they broke. You eat it. This is either a very dark joke or a very precise statement about how knowledge works in the game's cosmology, that it exists independently of the mind that held it, that it can be extracted from a person who can no longer use it and transferred to one who can. The madman's knowledge system is the game's most explicit formalization of insight as a resource that does not belong to any individual permanently. The old hunter bone, found near Ludwig's arena, belonged to an old hunter who moved so quickly during battle that it looked supernatural. When you use it, you add a super fast dodge roll. This is a normal gameplay upgrade, but the description is doing something. The old hunters were not superhuman by birth. They were trained by specific individuals, shaped by specific traditions, and the capabilities they had were earned and then, in some cases, literally calcified into the objects they left behind. The game's upgrade items are not just equipment, they are inheritance. The Cainhurst Castle is described in several item descriptions as having had a relationship with Byrgenwerth before the split between the church and the aristocracy. The Vilebloods received their blood from Byrgenwerth contact, or at least that is the implication. This means Annalise's situation is more complicated than the church's official history admits. The Vilebloods were not enemies of the proper blood tradition. They were a branch of it that the church decided was inconvenient and then labelled heretical. The label became policy. The policy became the executioners. The executioners became Alfred. Alfred tore a woman who could not die into pieces because of a category distinction that was made by the institution that trained him. The lore of the clockwise and counterclockwise metamorphosis runes found in the Chalice dungeons suggests that the Thumerians had a developed understanding of how to use runes to enhance physical capability. The runes predate the church. They predate Byrgenwerth. They are old enough that their original context has been entirely lost, and what remains is a set of practical effects with no surviving explanation. When you inscribe these runes in your character's mind, you are using knowledge that is older than the civilization you are trying to save. The hunt is a modern institution. The tools it runs on are ancient. Ariana, the woman of pleasure in Cathedral Ward, is one of the NPCs most directly connected to the Odon storyline, if you follow her arc through the game. She has vile blood in her ancestry, which means she carries the blood of Cainhurst even though she has no connection to the Cainhurst faction in her daily life. This blood makes her useful to Odon's purposes in a way she does not understand. Her child, born in the tomb of Odin if you send her there, is the celestial child that appears after you defeat Murgo's wet nurse, a strange creature that can give you a very rare blood gem and then dies. What Ariana thinks about any of this is not addressed. She simply exists within consequences she did not create. The beast patients in the healing workshops, the first enemies you fight in the game, used to be people who came to the church for treatment. They are in the locations where they received care. they transformed in the places where they were supposed to be healed. The game starts you in this space without telling you what it is. But by the end of the game, when you understand the arc of the church's history, you can return to those beginning spaces and read them differently. The opening of the game is not a tutorial. It is already the end of a story. You just did not have the context to see it yet. The Insight Shop, where you can purchase specific items from the Insight Messengers using accumulated insight points, contains several items that are otherwise extremely rare or unavailable in normal gameplay. The availability of these items for insight rather than blood echoes suggests that the system of the dream operates on a different economy from the system of the waking city. Knowledge can buy things in the dream that money cannot. This is another mechanical representation of a lore idea, that the currency of the Great One's world is understanding rather than wealth, and that the hunters who participate in both worlds have to navigate both economies. The celestial emissary boss, encountered in the upper cathedral ward, is a large blue creature surrounded by smaller versions of itself. The small ones can be killed. The large one is the actual boss. The lore description of celestial emissaries as beings that were elevated through the church's experiments and are now being used as communication intermediaries suggests that the big one in the arena is further along in its transformation than the smaller ones. It was a person. Multiple people. Potentially. It is now something the church was using to talk to something further out. Whether the communication ever worked in both directions is not answered. The sound design of Bloodborne encodes information in ways that are not immediately legible. The cries you can hear from Murgo at various points in the Menses nightmare are not ambient. They are specific. They shift in character as you move through the area. The wet nurse's audio design uses layered breathing sounds that suggest more than one body is present even before the fight shows you the multiples. These are choices made at a design level that reinforce the lore without stating it, that make the world feel coherent at a frequency below conscious attention, and that reward players who play with good headphones and a willingness to stop and listen. The player character's reason for coming to Yharnam is deliberately vague. You came for the blood. You were sick. You signed a contract you did not fully understand. This is not lazy writing. It is a design decision that places the player character inside the logic of the world from the first moment. You are not a hero who arrived to fix Yharnam. You are a customer who found out too late what the product actually does. Your transformation from patient to hunter to something beyond hunter is the arc of the game, and it starts from a position of vulnerability and need, which is exactly where the church wanted you. The final image of the game's third ending, the small creature you become being held by the doll, is one of the most tender images in a game that is not generally interested in tenderness. You have become a great one, or something like it, and the doll, who was made by a man who loved someone he could not keep, is holding you with the care she was designed to express. She calls you a child of the cosmos, her child. And the night finally ends. Whatever you became, you are not alone in it. That is not a resolution. But in Yharnam, it might be the closest thing available. The insight you carry into the final moments of the game is not a reward. It is a weight. Every point of understanding you accumulated over the course of the night came at a cost that the game tracked, even when you were not paying attention. The scholars of Bergenworth wanted insight. The choir wanted insight. Mikolash begged for eyes on the inside with his last breath. You gathered it by surviving things that were designed to end you, and the difference between you and them is not that you were smarter or more faithful or more deserving. It is that you kept moving when they stopped. The game does not congratulate you for this. It simply shows you what you became. The wolf motif that runs through the beast transformation iconography is worth pausing on. Yharnam's hunters dress in ways that evoke wolves even before the transformation. The hats, the cloaks, the silhouettes. There is a visual language being established about predation and prey that the game then inverts systematically. The hunters are wolves, the beasts are wolves. The great ones are something that wolves do not have a word for. The prey at the beginning of the food chain is you, the patient, the outsider, the one who came seeking healing, and instead became a participant in a system of consumption that has no top and no bottom, only the endless recycling of blood into echoes into blood. The Healing Church's architecture tells its own story if you read it as a document rather than a backdrop. The cathedral ward is built to impress, to dwarf the human body, to make the individual feel small and the institution feel eternal. The scale is not accidental. The church understood the relationship between built space and belief, and it designed its spaces to produce awe before it produced anything else. The workshops and the clinics are built differently, pragmatically, for function. The divergence between those two modes of construction tracks exactly the divergence between what the church said it was and what it actually was. The beautiful buildings were for the faithful. The functional buildings were where the work happened. The lamp system, by which hunters navigate between the waking city and the dream, is spatially incoherent in ways the game never addresses and does not need to. The lamps are not teleporters, they are thresholds. The geometry of Yharnam does not have to make physical sense, because Yharnam is not a physically coherent place by the time you arrive. The blood moon has already begun its rise. The great ones are already pressing against the fabric of the city. The fact that you can step through a lamp and be somewhere that should be hours away on foot is not a game convenience. It is a symptom. The city is coming apart at its spatial seams. The suspicious beggar, found in the Forbidden Woods and then optionally sent to Iosefka's clinic or the Odon Chapel, is one of the NPCs the game uses to test whether the player has internalized its lesson about trust. He presents as harmless. He is plausibly harmless in the early game. If you send him to the chapel, he eventually kills the other survivors who sheltered there. If you send him to the clinic, the false Iosefka deals with him. If you investigate him in the Forbidden Woods with enough curiosity, you find evidence that he is not what he claims. The game does not flag this with a warning. It simply places the evidence and waits to see whether you are paying attention. The verb the game uses most consistently in its item descriptions is suggest. Not confirm, not state, suggest. This is the epistemological position of everyone in Yharnam relative to what is actually happening to them. The scholars suggested theories about the blood. The church suggested interpretations of Great One contact. The hunters suggested frameworks for understanding what they were killing. Nobody knew. The word suggests this without saying it, which is exactly the method the entire game uses, showing you the shape of an absence rather than filling it in. The Great One called Odin, who exists only as sound and breath, raises a question the game does not answer about what it means for an entity to exist at all. Odin has no body. He is not in any location you can visit. He operates entirely through secondary effects: his chapel, his followers, his children. He is the most present absent thing in the game. Everything connected to him is defined by his not being there, by the vacuum his formlessness creates. When you fight in his tomb and deal with the consequences of his relationships with human beings, you are dealing with the downstream effects of an entity who cannot be encountered directly. He is the purest expression of what the Great Ones are in the game, forces whose influence is total and whose nature is inaccessible. The workshop tools scattered through the game, the ones that unlock new rune slots and the ability to gem certain weapons, are not simply inventory items. They are pieces of a craft tradition that was deliberately fragmented. When the church consolidated control over the hunter vocation, it did not destroy the old knowledge, it distributed it, made it inaccessible through scattering rather than elimination. Finding these tools in the places you find them, in the locked rooms of dead researchers, in the hidden areas of crumbling buildings, suggests a history of people who tried to preserve something against the tide of institutional control, and who largely succeeded in the sense that the things survived, even if the people did not. The Bloodborne community's collective act of lore reconstruction, conducted over years of forum posts and wiki edits and video essays, is itself a kind of echo of what the game's characters are doing. Yharnam pieced together what he could of his situation. Willem sat at the edge of his lake, accumulating whatever he could reach. Mikolash filled cage after cage with prayer. The players outside the game have been doing the same thing, trying to assemble a coherent picture from fragments that were never meant to be fully coherent. The game rewards this not with a final answer, but with better questions. That is, in the end, what all of Bjergenwerth's research produced as well. The blood dregs collected by the Vile Bloods and stored in Annelise's throne room are described as the remains of hunters, the residue left when a hunter dies in a specific context. Annelise consumes them. This is framed by the Church as proof of the Vile Blood's depravity, a queen feeding on the remnants of hunters. But the lore does not confirm the Church's framing. The blood dregs might be a form of communion. They might be a form of accumulation. They might be a practice with a meaning the Church never understood and labelled evil out of convenience. Annelise herself does not explain. She is still there. She has time. She can wait for someone to ask the right question. The doll's final words in the third ending, calling the transformed player her child, close a circle that opened with Yharnam creating her in the image of a woman he could not keep. He made something capable of love, and then installed it in a dream where love had no ordinary object. She turned that capacity toward the hunters who passed through, generation after generation, none of whom she could hold on to. And then one of them became something she could hold, not the person she knew. Something new. Whether this is consolation or tragedy depends entirely on what you think love requires in order to be real. The game has thought about this question more carefully than most, and has declined to answer it, which is its own kind of answer. You said, Continua Continline, 07 Claude responded. The Chalice dungeons contain a boss called Yharnam, Thumerian Queen, who is the most direct surviving link to the civilization buried beneath the city. The Chalice dungeons contain a boss called Yharnam, Thumerian Queen, who is the most direct surviving link to the civilization buried beneath the city. She is pregnant when you fight her. She holds up her child as a shield at one point in the fight, not as a weapon, as protection, as a desperate interposition of the most important thing she has between herself and the thing trying to kill her. The game does not ask you to stop. It does not offer an alternative. You fight through it. The child she is carrying is implied by certain item descriptions to be connected to the bloodline that eventually produces the events of the surface game. You are killing the ancestor of the catastrophe you are trying to survive. The timeline folds back on itself, and the game says nothing about it. The old blood's effect on memory is one of the threads that the game pulls at without fully unravelling. The echoes you collect are memories in some form, the residual imprint of a life that has ended. The blood itself carries the memories of everyone who has used it before. When a hunter drinks a blood vial in the field, they are not just receiving a medical substance. They are receiving something that has passed through other bodies, carried other histories, accumulated other impressions. The beast transformation might be partly a memory problem, the body remembering something older than itself, the blood recalling a shape it held before the human shape was layered over it. The lanterns that serve as checkpoints are always found near bodies. This is easy to overlook because the game is full of bodies and the lanterns are easy to treat as purely functional. But the placement is consistent enough to be deliberate. The light appears where someone stopped moving. Whether the lanterns were drawn to the deaths or the deaths accumulated around the lanterns over the long history of the hunt is not clarified. Both interpretations produce the same image. Hunters have been dying in these spots for a very long time. The light kept burning. Nobody came to move them. The powder keg's expulsion from the workshop was officially about safety. The weapons they designed were too unpredictable, too destructive, too difficult to control in the close-quarters environments where most hunting happened. The official record frames this as a practical decision. The item descriptions suggest something more political. The powder kegs were not simply dangerous, they were embarrassing. They represented an approach to the hunt that undermined the image of controlled, disciplined, almost surgical violence that the church wanted the hunter vocation to project. The beast plague required a certain kind of management, and the powder keg's approach was too honest about the scale of what was actually happening. You do not bring that much explosive force to a problem you believe is under control. Simon's death at the end of his questline is one of the quieter tragedies in the DLC, because he dies having accomplished something. He gathered evidence. He bore witness. He understood what happened at the fishing hamlet, and he carried that understanding through the nightmare until he could not carry anything anymore. The tragedy is not that he failed. The tragedy is that bearing witness turned out to be insufficient. There is nobody left to tell. The information he assembled with such care and such personal cost dies with him in a corner of a nightmare that no scholar from the waking world will ever visit. The truth happened. It was understood. It made no difference. The fishing hamlet's people were transformed by what the church did to them, but not in the direction of the beast. They became something marine, something that suggests the great one they coexisted with had a nature adjacent to water, to depth, to the oceanic dark. The fishermen enemies move like creatures adapted to a different medium. Their hostility is not the mindless aggression of the beast plague's victims. It is targeted. They remember. Whatever was done to them did not erase the people underneath. It preserved them inside bodies that no longer match what they were. This is a different horror from the beast transformation, more specific, more personal, and in some ways harder to look at directly. The Kirkhammer, one of the starter weapons, belonged to a church hunter and combines a small sword with an enormous stone hammer. The combination is theologically legible. The sword for the precision work, the hammer for the statement. The church needed hunters who could operate with delicacy when delicacy served the institution, and with overwhelming force when the situation required a demonstration. The Kirkhammer is both of those things attached to a single handle. The hunter who carried it was expected to know which end to use and when. The game gives it to you early, without explaining any of this. It sits in your hand as a fact about the world before you have the context to read it. The healing church's use of blood as both medicine and sacrament created a theological problem it never fully resolved. If the blood heals, it is medicine. If the blood connects the user to something divine, it is a ritual substance. If it does both, then healing and divinity are the same thing, which is either a profound truth or a category error that the church never had to confront, because the blood worked well enough, for long enough, that nobody was asking hard questions. By the time the questions became unavoidable, the institutions built around not asking them were too entrenched to change. The beast plague is partly the result of a philosophical mistake that calcified into policy before anyone noticed it was a mistake. The graveguard set, worn by the cemetery workers you encounter in the Cathedral Ward area, suggests an entire labour class built around the management of the hunt's dead. Someone had to bury the hunters who did not come back. Someone had to deal with the beasts that were killed in the streets. The graveguard did this work quietly and consistently, and the game gives them their own armour set and their own item descriptions, which is more attention than most games would give to this category of person. They were not hunters. They were not clergy. They were the people who cleaned up after both, and the game treats this as a vocation worthy of record. The Madwoman set, found in Hemwick, connects the Charnel Lane area to a tradition of folk practice that operated entirely outside the church's formal structures. The madwoman who owned it was not a hunter. She was not a scholar. She was a practitioner of something older than either, a blood magic tradition that the church would have called heresy if it had bothered to notice. The game places her in an area associated with the Witch of Hemwick Boss, which suggests a lineage of non-institutional knowledge about blood and sight, and the things that can be done with both. The church did not create this knowledge. It inherited a world where the knowledge already existed, and then spent considerable effort pretending it had not. Valter, the League Confederate you encounter in the Nightmare Frontier, founded an organization dedicated to crushing vermin, the small insects only League members can see. He believes the vermin are the source of the corruption. He has gathered followers around this belief and built a covenant structure on top of it. Whether the vermin are real in any objective sense, or whether seeing them is a symptom of a specific kind of insight-adjacent madness, is left genuinely open. Valter himself eventually loses the ability to see them and considers this a kind of death. His purpose was built on perception. When the perception changed, the purpose went with it. He hands you his helm and walks into the nightmare and does not come back. The game frames this as a completion. The impurity rune associated with Valter's League is described in terms that distinguish between the corruption of the beast and a different kind of corruption that comes from outside rather than inside. The vermin Valter sees are external agents. The beast plague is an internal transformation. These are different categories of horror, and the League's existence suggests that some hunters developed a framework for distinguishing between them, even if that framework was partially or entirely delusional. The rune encodes the distinction regardless of whether the distinction is real. This is how the game handles belief throughout. The belief produces real effects even when its object is uncertain. The celestial emissary's smaller forms, which surround the large boss in the upper cathedral ward, can be killed without triggering the main fight. You can clear the room of the small ones first, and then engage the large one alone. This is a mechanical option the game offers, without comment. What it means in lore terms, if it means anything, is that the transformed subjects who surround the more fully transformed one are not extensions of it. They are individuals who happen to transform in proximity. Killing them first does not weaken the large one. They were never connected in the way the encounter's staging implies. The game sets up a visual suggestion and then lets the mechanics contradict it quietly. The choir's upper levels, which you access through the one elevator in the cathedral ward that goes up instead of down, are decorated differently from the lower church spaces. The architecture shifts. The light changes. The enemies are more alien, further along in whatever transformation the choir was pursuing. The spatial logic of going up to reach the most transgressive content is deliberate. The Healing Church's official theology was concerned with earthly healing. The choir's ambitions were literally elevated above that baseline. They were reaching for something the ordinary clergy were not equipped to understand, and the building reflects this in the way it handles the vertical axis. Below is the city. Above is whatever the choir thought it was approaching. The formula Lawrence chose when he founded the Healing Church was not the only option available to him. The lore implies that Willem had developed alternatives, paths that might have produced contact with the Great Ones without the beast plague, slower perhaps, more uncertain, but without the systematic catastrophe baked into the blood ministration. Lawrence chose speed and scale. He wanted to help people now, not eventually. This is not a monstrous motivation. It is an entirely recognizable one. The road to Yharnam's destruction was paved with exactly the kind of good intentions that do not seem like intentions at all, because they look so much like urgency. The umbilical cord you find in the abandoned workshop, Iosefka's false offering, and the one connected to Ariana's child, are each described in language that emphasizes connection and severance simultaneously. They are things that once linked two beings, and now link nothing. They are the physical remainder of a relationship that ended at birth. Consuming them is consuming the record of a connection, taking the evidence of a bond into yourself in order to build a different kind of bond the one that makes the third ending possible. The game uses the most primal image of biological connection as the key to cosmic transformation. This is either beautiful or disturbing or both, and the game is entirely comfortable letting it be all three at once. The note found near the tomb of Odin early in the game, warning you not to trust the church, was written by someone who understood enough to warn, but not enough to survive. Notes in Bloodborne are always posthumous. The person who left them is always already gone. The note system the game inherited from Dark Souls is used differently here, less as player-to-player communication, and more as the residue of people who tried to help and ran out of time before they could do enough of it. Every helpful note in Yharnam is a small monument to a specific failure. Someone knew something. Someone tried to pass it on. The night got them anyway. The hunter's dream flowers, which bloom around the workshop, and the doll's walking paths are never named in any item description. They simply exist. They are the one piece of the dream that does not connect to anything in the waking world's lore, that does not encode a reference or a history. They are just flowers, growing in a dream, tended by nobody, present because a dream needs something soft in it, or it becomes only nightmare. Gehrman planted them, perhaps. Or they grew on their own because the dream needed them. Or the moon presence included them as part of the cage's design, understanding that a beautiful prison holds its occupants more effectively than a bare one. The game does not say the flowers bloom in the alien light and the doll walks among them, and the answer, if there is one, is somewhere in that image rather than in any description attached to it. You said, continue for 3 hours, more continue for 3 hours, more 1854 Claude responded. The trick of Yharnam is that it was already over before you arrived. The trick of Yharnam is that it was already over before you arrived. This is not a city in crisis. It is a city in aftermath. The crisis happened across decades of blood ministration and gradual transformation and institutional denial. And what you walk into on the first night is not the beginning of a catastrophe, but the final expression of one. The hunters who came before you did not fail to prevent this. They were part of the mechanism that produced it. Every beast they killed brought the church another season of legitimacy, another year of blood distribution, another generation of patients who trusted the institution that was slowly poisoning them. The hunt was not a response to the plague. The hunt was the plague's support structure, the thing that made it sustainable long enough to become total. The cleric beast's size relative to the ordinary beasts you fight later in the game raises a question the lore never answers directly. Why do some transformations produce creatures of that scale? The ordinary Yharnamites who transform become large, dangerous, roughly humanoid things. The cleric beast is something different in degree, if not in kind, a transformation that went further, produced more, accumulated more mass and more wrongness than the standard progression suggests. Item descriptions elsewhere in the game gesture at the idea that particularly strong faith, or particularly deep exposure to the blood, or some combination of the two, can accelerate and intensify the transformation. The clergy were exposed to more blood than ordinary citizens. They also believed in it more completely. Whether belief itself is a factor in transformation is one of those questions Bloodborne places carefully in the space between its stated lore and its implications. The saw cleaver is the most common starting weapon, and the one most associated with the image of the hunter in the game's promotional material. Its description is brief. It was used to fight the beasts. It was effective. It folds for storage. There is nothing in the description that encodes tragedy or history or cosmic weight. It is a tool. The game gives you this tool first and makes it effective throughout, because the game understands that the horror of Yharnam is not located in the exotic and the hidden. It is located in the ordinary. The saw cleaver is ordinary. Hunters used it every night. The night was ordinary to them. The ordinariness of systematic atrocity is the point the game is making with its most basic piece of equipment, and it makes that point without saying a word about it. Eileen the Crow is one of the most complete characters in the game's NPC roster, which means she has approximately 4 conversations available before her questline concludes. She is an old hunter. She kills hunters who have gone mad, which is a vocation the game frames as merciful and which functions as a mirror of the broader hunt. The hunt kills beasts. Eileen kills hunters who became something the hunt cannot accommodate. The recursion is deliberate. Every system in Bloodborne generates its own cleanup problem, and the cleanup problem generates its own cleanup problem, and the levels go down as far as you care to look. Eileen's feathers and her manner and her practiced efficiency suggests someone who has been at this long enough to have stopped feeling anything complicated about it, and the small crack in that composure, visible when she is injured and still trying to complete her mission, is the game giving you a glimpse of what the efficiency costs. The Crow of Cainhurst set, associated with Eileen, connects her to the Cainhurst lineage in a way the game does not explain fully. Whether she has vile blood ancestry, whether she worked with or against the Cainhurst faction at some point in her history, whether the Crow iconography is a personal choice or an institutional marker, none of this is resolved. The set exists. The description suggests a history. The history is not narrated. This is the game's standard operation, giving you the shape of a person's life without filling it in, trusting you to understand that the outline implies a fullness even if you cannot see it. The hunter garb's common elements, the long coat, the wide hat, the gloves, trace back to a specific silhouette that the workshop established in its early days. When you find variations on this silhouette throughout the game, on NPCs, on bosses, on the enemies in the hunter's nightmare, you are recognizing a uniform that predates the church's consolidation and persisted through it because the function it served was real, regardless of the politics. The coat stops some things. The hat keeps certain fluid off your face. The gloves make certain grips possible. The hunter's silhouette is not aesthetic first. It is engineering. The aesthetic came after. The romanticism of the hunter image built on top of a set of practical solutions to practical problems. And by the time you encounter it, the practical problems are so large that the romanticism has become grotesque. The Bloodborne soundtrack uses instruments associated with Romantic-era orchestral composition, strings and brass and choir, in ways that are systematically wrong. The tempos shift unexpectedly. The harmonies resolve in directions that feel almost correct, and then do not. The choir vocals in boss music are wordless in most cases, which means they carry emotional weight without semantic content, which means the listener's nervous system responds to the feeling of meaning without being given any actual meaning to attach it to. This is exactly what the blood does in the game's lore. It produces an experience of significance without providing the framework to understand what the significance is. The music is not accompanying the game's themes, it is expressing them in a different medium. The bloodlicker enemies encountered in the hunter's nightmare are attracted to blood pools on the ground. They will stop attacking you to drink from a corpse if one is available. The behaviour is not random. It is a direct expression of what the blood does to everything it touches deeply enough. The bloodlickers are former hunters, the lore implies, or at minimum former humans, who were exposed to enough of the old blood that the blood itself became the primary drive. They are not pursuing you because you are a threat, or because you are prey in the ordinary sense. They are pursuing you because you are a source. Everything in Yharnam eventually becomes either a source or a consumer of the blood. And the distinction between those two categories is the closest thing the game has to a moral axis. The research hall's layout, with its multi-level structure and its caged patients visible from walkways above, is designed to make you feel like an observer before you feel like a participant. You are looking down at things that are suffering before you are among them. The game uses this architectural positioning deliberately. The church positioned itself above its patients in exactly this way, observing from a distance, recording results, maintaining the clinical remove that made the experiments feel like science rather than cruelty. When you descend into the hall and fight among the transformed patients, the architectural message changes. You cannot maintain the observer position. You are in it now. The game collapses the distance between the watcher and the watched, and does not let you restore it. The Bloodstone chunk, one of the highest tier upgrade materials, is described as a solid mass of blood that has crystallized over a very long period. This is not metaphorical. The game's lore suggests that blood exposed to significant Great One influence over sufficient time can change its physical state, can become something more like stone than liquid, can carry its properties in a concentrated and stable form. The chunks are not manufactured, they are accumulated. They formed in places where the blood was present in quantity for long enough that the process could complete. What this means about the history of the locations where they are found is left to inference. The inference is not pleasant. The forsaken Cainhurst Castle's interior, its ballroom and its dining hall and its frozen winter garden, describes a civilization that had reached a kind of completion before it was ended. The Vilebloods were not struggling. They were established. The aristocratic culture of Cainhurst had found a stable relationship with the blood they carried, and had built something around it that functioned, that had aesthetics and rituals and social structure. The church came not because Cainhurst was failing, or dangerous, or producing beasts. It came because Cainhurst represented a different relationship with the blood than the one the church controlled. And a different relationship was a competing relationship. And a competing relationship was a threat to the monopoly that the church's power depended on. The massacre of Cainhurst was institutional violence in the most literal sense. An institution destroyed something it could not absorb. The eye pendants and the eye motifs carved into the church's architecture throughout the cathedral ward are not decorative. The eye is the church's central symbol because the church's central promise was a kind of vision, a way of seeing the world correctly, a framework for understanding what was happening and why. The irony is that the church was specifically and systematically not seeing. It was generating a theology of vision while blinding itself to the consequences of its own practices. The eyes carved in stone watched while the patients in the research hall were transformed into things that could no longer watch back. The symbol outlasted the thing it was supposed to represent, which is the usual trajectory of institutional symbols. Jura's Gatling gun, which you can hear before you can see him if you approach Old Yharnam from the correct direction, announces him as a threat before he becomes a character. The sound of suppressing fire is your first piece of information about him. The second piece is that the fire is directed away from you unless you start attacking the beasts he is protecting. This sequence of information, threat, then unexpected discrimination, then the possibility of conversation, is a compressed version of what the game does with most of its moral complexities. It starts by presenting something as a danger and then shows you that the thing you were prepared to treat as simply dangerous has a position, a history, a reason. Jura chose the beasts over the hunt. He had enough information to make that choice deliberately. The game gives you the choice to respect it. The Forbidden Woods village, populated by enemies who have undergone the snake transformation associated with the area, contains a few structures that suggest it was once an ordinary agricultural settlement. The farm implements, the storage buildings, the layout of the space, something came to this place and found ordinary people living ordinary lives, and the contact transformed them in a direction that the church's blood ministration did not produce. The snake transformation is parasitic rather than viral. Something entered these people rather than something latent in them being activated. The distinction matters because it suggests that the Great One's influence on human biology is not uniform, that different entities produce different results, and that the diversity of transformations you encounter across the game is not random variation, but a map of different points of contact. With different sources, the whirligig-saw, one of the Dielk weapons, is a powder keg invention and is essentially an industrial buzzsaw mounted on a pole. The flavor text describes it as an innovation the church found excessive and embarrassing. The mechanical behavior of the weapon in gameplay, its ability to be revved into a spinning state that deals continuous damage, is extremely effective against the beast-type enemies that make up the majority of the game's encounters. The powder kegs were right. The weapon works. The church's objection was not that the weapon failed to solve the problem. The objection was that the weapon was too honest about what the problem was. A buzzsaw says the beasts need to be destroyed at industrial scale. The church wanted the hunt to look like a medical service, not an extermination program. The lore around the Executioner faction develops one of the game's most consistent themes, which is the way institutions produce true believers who cannot survive the institutions that made them. Alfred is the clearest example, but not the only one. Logarius himself, who spent years at Canehurst holding a secret that would have destroyed the church's official history, is a figure who gave his life to a purpose and was not wrong to do so in the terms available to him. He was protecting something real, which was the stability of an institution that was helping people, even if the help was contaminated. The fact that the institution was also systematically harmful does not erase the genuine help. This is the uncomfortable truth the game keeps turning over. The church was real medicine and real horror simultaneously, and the people who served it with complete sincerity were serving both of those things at once. The Tomb of Odin, the first named landmark the game sends you toward, is an outdoor space, where a Great One's influence is most directly present in the early game. The enemies there include the Odin Wraith users, cultists who have organised their lives around the Formless One's presence. They are not transformed, they are not beasts. They are people who have chosen a relationship with something alien and have remained, on the surface, functional. The game puts them in your path early to establish that not every form of corruption is physical, that some people are changed completely by their beliefs, without their bodies providing any visible evidence of the change. The Nightmare Lecture Building's blackboards contain partially legible notes from courses that were apparently offered there. Blood theory, Great One contact methodology, the nature of insight as a physical phenomenon. These are not the syllabi of a normal academic institution. They are the curriculum of people who had gone far enough into the research to understand that the research had a direction, that the questions it was asking led somewhere specific, and who were teaching the next generation to go further. The students who attended those lectures are now the crawling scholars in the hallways. The curriculum worked. It produced exactly what it was designed to produce. And what it was designed to produce was contact, and the contact, as contact always does in this game, left nothing of the person who achieved it. The Lunarium key, found in the lecture building and used to access the roof where you encounter Rom, is a mundane object in an unmundane space. Its description says only that it unlocks a room used for celestial observation. The scholars who used the Lunarium were watching the sky with the same instruments that any period astronomer would use, and what they were watching for was not stars in the scientific sense, but presences, entities that the sky might reveal if the observer had sufficient insight and sufficient patience. The line between astronomy and theology is always thin in contexts where the sky is understood to be inhabited, and in the lecture building that line has been crossed so thoroughly that the key to the observatory is also the key to the boss fight that removes the veil from reality. The choir's experiments with Ebrietas produce something that the lore describes in fragments across several item descriptions without ever assembling into a single account. They learned to use her as an amplifier. They developed rituals around her presence. They built the Altar of Despair as a permanent installation rather than a temporary ritual space, which suggests they achieved something consistent enough to require a fixed infrastructure. Whether Ebrietas was a willing participant in any of this is the question the game poses by making her a boss encounter. She attacks you when you approach. This could mean she was never willing. It could mean she has been alone long enough to lose the distinction between threat and presence. It could mean the choir's relationship with her was more complicated than either willing participation or coercion, and that the categories themselves are insufficient. The story of the old hunters whose names are attached to specific sets of armour in the Delk is told almost entirely through description text and environmental placement. You find their equipment in the places where they operated, which means finding it in the nightmare, which means they died in the nightmare, which means they are among those the curse of Kos trapped there. The nightmare holds the worst hunters, the game says, but the equipment of the named hunters suggests individuals with complex histories rather than simply monstrous ones. They went too far. The going too far happened in specific ways, for specific reasons, in a world that did not give them many options for stopping. The nightmare does not distinguish between the hunter who went too far reluctantly and the one who did it enthusiastically. It keeps them both. The Bloodborne world's relationship to the moon is layered in ways that the surface reading misses. The hunt happens at night, because night is when the veil between the waking world and the nightmare is thinnest, and the moon is the most obvious marker of that thinning. But the moon in Bloodborne is not simply a symbol, it is a presence. The moon presence is not named metaphorically. It is actually there, in some sense, behind or within or as the moon, and its attention to Yharnam specifically is part of what makes the city's situation unique among all the places where the old blood might have been used. Yharnam was already in the moon presence's field of view before Lawrence founded the church. The church's work made Yharnam interesting to it. The hunt kept it interested. The entire history of the city might be a process of cultivation conducted by something patient enough to work on generational timescales. The beast roar is a hunter tool that lets you emit the howl of a beast to stagger enemies. Its description frames this not as the hunter mimicking the beast, but as the hunter releasing something that was already inside them. A resonance with the beast nature that the blood creates in anyone who uses it long enough. Every hunter carries some version of the transformation. The hunt is not a clean separation between the human and the monstrous. It is a managed proximity, a constant negotiation with something inside that the hunter's discipline holds at a specific distance. The beast roar is what happens when you stop negotiating for a moment and let the distance collapse. The game gives it to you as a tool. The tool is also a confession. The winter lanterns, which appear in the nightmare spaces and inflict frenzy with their gaze, carry the eyes of Rom in their exposed brains. They are the nightmare's version of an insight mechanic, creatures that punish you for looking at them by filling your mind with something it cannot contain. The frenzy they inflict is not madness in the psychological sense, it is overflow. Too much of the wrong kind of understanding filling a vessel that was not designed to hold it. The winter lanterns are enemies that the lore has made into a thesis statement, the idea that certain kinds of seeing are fatal not because they reveal dangerous information, but because the act of receiving the information destroys the receiver. They are beautiful in a nauseating way, these creatures, and the game is aware of this and uses it. The choir's white robes, worn by the enemies in the upper cathedral ward, are the colour of things that aspire to purity. The church's lower clergy wear the darker robes of institutional labour. The choir wears white because they believed they were the elevated portion of an already elevated institution, the ones who had gone far enough toward the great ones to have left the merely human concerns of healing and administration behind them. The white is aspirational. It is also what you see when you first encounter these enemies and register them as different from the lower clergy. Before you understand what the difference means, the game lets you read the visual language of the church's hierarchy before it gives you the words to describe what you are reading. The Iosefka's blood vial, which you can receive from the real Iosefka early in the game before she is displaced, is a higher quality healing item than the standard blood vials, and its description notes that her ministrations are gentle and careful. The real Iosefka, the one you never fully meet, is characterized entirely by the quality of her work and a locked door. She exists in the game as a before, the before being displaced by the church researcher who takes her place and her name and her clinic. You never know what happened to her. The false Iosefka, when she is dying at the end of her questline, does not tell you. The real one is gone before the game's narrative begins in any meaningful sense, and all that remains of her is a vial of blood that heals you a little better than the standard option, and a note that she cared about doing her work well. The Yahargul Chapel area, which you reach through an abduction mechanic if you are killed by a kidnapper enemy before the blood moon rises, is one of the most disorienting spaces in the game on a first playthrough. You wake up in a prison. The enemies there are stronger than anything you have encountered. The architecture is wrong in ways that suggest you are somewhere adjacent to the Mensis nightmare, without being fully inside it. This is the game forcing you forward in time against your will, showing you a version of the world that your character has not reached yet by the normal progression. The Yahargul abduction is a kind of spoiler built into the world's geography, a way of telling you where the story is going before you have the context to understand what you are seeing. The School of Mensis had a plan. This is worth stating plainly because the chaos of the Mensis nightmare and the horror of what the school ultimately produced makes it easy to read them as simply mad, as people who lost control of something and were destroyed by it. But the plan was coherent at its inception. They intended to contact a Great One. They built a body large enough to get noticed. They opened a nightmare. They placed themselves inside it with a Great One's infant, Murgo, using the connection to that infant to maintain the contact they had established. The plan worked. The contact was achieved. The cost was the scholars themselves, who were hollowed out by the contact and left as the bodies hanging in the iron cage beneath the brain that formed from what was extracted from them. A successful plan that destroyed everyone who executed it is still, in the terms the plan was conceived in, a success. The Mensis scholars got what they wanted. The game is very precise about this. The Hunter's Nightmare's sky is red in a way that the waking world's blood moon is not. The blood moon of Yharnam is ominous, a change in the world's character that signals the endgame approaching. The nightmare's sky is simply the colour of accumulated blood, the colour of everything that happened in that space before you arrived, and that continues to happen regardless of your presence. The sky is red because the sky has been red for as long as the nightmare has existed, and will be red for as long as it continues to exist, which is, the lore implies, as long as the curse of Kos holds. The nightmare is not building towards something. It arrived. The horror you encounter there is not escalating. It is simply present, as total and as permanent as the colour of the sky above it. The amygdala boss fight, encountered in the Nightmare Frontier, is unusual because the creature you fight is clearly not the same kind of entity as the amygdalae attached to buildings in the waking world. The waking world amygdalae are infrastructure. They are present, enormous, and only visible to those with enough insight, but they are not aggressive by default. The nightmare amygdala is aggressive. It is alone in a way the waking world ones are not. Whether the isolation of the nightmare is what made it dangerous, or whether the nightmare collects dangerous versions of entities that have peaceful counterparts elsewhere, is not resolved. The fight itself, with the creature grabbing you and smashing you against the ground with a kind of frustrated violence, feels less like a monster attack and more like something very large trying to remove something very small and irritating from a surface it is trying to occupy. The scale difference is the horror. You are not fighting an enemy. You are being inconvenienced by something that could erase you without fully attending to the task. The specific words of Mikolash's prayer, asking Kos, or some say Cosm, to grant eyes on the inside, encode a distinction the game is careful about. Eyes on the inside is not the same as vision. It is not clarity or understanding or wisdom. It is a different kind of perception, one that operates from within rather than receiving input from without. The scholars who went furthest in the research were not trying to see more of the external world. They were trying to develop a sensory apparatus for something that exists inside the mind or inside the blood or inside whatever it is that the Great Ones touch when they touch a human consciousness. Mikolash understood this well enough to name it precisely. He just could not reach it. He spent everything he had reaching for it and came up short and died with the prayer still in his mouth. The dark beast Paal, which appears both in the Yharnam area and in a chalice dungeon, is surrounded in both versions by a field of lightning that it generates from its own body. The item descriptions connected to lightning-type damage in the game associate it with the exposure to certain kinds of Great One influence over a very long time. A kind of charge that builds up in blood that has been in contact with the right kind of alien energy for sufficient duration. Paal is old enough that the transformation has reached a stage the game rarely shows you. A beast that has become partly elemental, that generates something from within itself rather than simply being a physical danger. The oldest transformations in Bloodborne are not the most physically threatening. They are the most conceptually disturbing, the ones that suggest the process goes further than the beast and keeps going. Lady Maria's arena, the astral clock tower, is a beautiful space in a nightmare. The clock tower is full of astronomical instruments and the bodies of experimental subjects and the frozen machinery of something that was once trying to measure time or distance or something else that clockwork is good for. Maria sits at the top in a chair, asleep or unconscious, waiting to be disturbed. The fight against her is one of the most technically demanding in the game, and also one of the most emotionally precise. She fights with a hunter's discipline and a hunter's skill, and at two different points in the fight introduces blood into her attacks, igniting it in the first phase change and adding a ghostly extension of the blood in the second. She refused to use her weapon after the Hamlet. She buried it, but the blood in her body does not share her ethics, and the fight shows you the violence she tried to retire from reasserting itself in stages as you push her harder. The tonsil stone, obtained from certain NPCs, and used to avoid being attacked by the amygdala at the cathedral ward lamp, is one of the game's most specific jokes about knowledge and safety. The stone is described as a murmuring stone that the Great Ones use to communicate with those they favour. Carrying its signals to the amygdala that you are known, that you have some relationship with the Great Ones that makes you not prey in the usual sense. The joke is that you get this stone by talking to a man in a window who tells you to bring it to the cathedral as an offering. He is sending you into the amygdala's range with a credential. Whether the credential is real, whether the stone actually signals what he claims it signals, is not explained. It works. The amygdala transports you instead of killing you. The mechanism behind why it works is as opaque as everything else about the Great One's behaviour, and the game is comfortable with that opacity in a way that the scholars in the lore never managed to be. The formula for the ritual chalices, which require materials like ritual blood, cold blood flowers, and arcane haze, is another piece of the game's implicit argument that the Thumerian civilization's knowledge was more complete than anything that came after it. The chalice rituals were not invented by Bergenworth or the Church. They were inherited, preserved imperfectly, practiced without full understanding of what they were doing. When you perform a chalice ritual in the game, you are using a technology whose operating principles were lost before you were born. You get results. You do not know why you get results. This is the relationship the entire world of Bloodborne has with the knowledge it uses. The technology works, the understanding is gone. The gap between those two facts is where the horror lives. The plain tombstones in the Hunter's Dream Workshop area, which can be activated to summon Valta or the old Hunter's spirit echoes, are not graves in the ordinary sense. They are connection points, places where the dream structure allows access to the residual presence of people who were part of the hunt's history. The old hunters summoned through the tombstones are not the people themselves. They are the echoes, the imprints, the weight that specific hunters left in the dream by passing through it. Yharnam has been in the dream long enough that his presence there is structural, load-bearing. The old hunters whose echoes you can summon are present in a lesser degree, available to help in the way that a tool left behind by someone skilled is helpful even when the person is gone. The Cainhurst Reaper enemies, which are the long-limbed things that patrol the castle with their sickles, move differently from any other enemy in the game. Their gait is wrong in a specific way, too fluid, too jointless, suggesting a relationship to the human form that is more distant than the standard transformations. The lore does not explain what they are. The visual design says something about aristocratic decay, the servants of an institution left to change at their own pace for a very long time, and the change having gone in a direction that the institution could not have anticipated when it began. Cainhurst was frozen in time in some sense when the church massacred it, and the Reapers are what happened to the parts that were not killed, left to develop in a sealed castle for as long as the castle has been sealed. The hunter's dream has a postal system of sorts, embodied by the messengers who carry items and deliver purchases. The messengers are small, pale creatures of uncertain origin, present throughout the game world as well as the dream, and their item descriptions suggest they are beings from the dream, who have developed enough relationship with specific hunters to serve them across the boundary between the dream and the waking world. They wear hats and accessories that you can give them, and they respond to this with what looks like pleasure. The messengers are not explained. They are not lore objects in the sense that the major factions and characters are. They are the game's way of humanizing the dream's infrastructure, of suggesting that the system which entraps hunters also contains things that are simply charming, that existence in the dream is not only horror. The fact that the game allows you to kill every NPC you encounter, and that killing some of them before their questlines complete produces different outcomes than letting the questlines run, is a design decision that encodes a specific moral position. You are not required to engage with the human elements of Yharnam. The game will not stop you from treating every person you encounter as an obstacle. But if you do, you will miss things, not rewards in the mechanical sense, but understanding. The game hides its emotional content behind its NPCs in a way that means the most efficient path through it is also the most impoverished one. The hunters who went too far in the lore often went too far in exactly this direction, treating everything as an obstacle to the goal, losing the texture of what made the goal worth pursuing in the first place. The abandoned old workshop, hidden inside the healing church itself, is the original space where Yharnam established the hunter vocation. It is a broken-down version of the hunter's dream workshop, the same layout, the same structures, but dilapidated, unused, stripped of everything that made it functional. The doll figure that sits in the corner of this space is not the plain doll. It is a discarded prototype, an earlier attempt at the same object, sitting in the ruin of the original workshop. This space exists to tell you that the hunter's dream is not the origin of the hunt. It is a copy of something that came before, a preservation, a recreation. The real workshop was abandoned when the church consolidated power and Yharnam retreated into the dream. The dream workshop is the memory of the real one, kept perfect and functional while the original collapsed around its abandonment. The insight cost of certain items in the insight shop, particularly the living string and certain high-tier materials, is an implicit statement about the relationship between understanding and resource. In the waking world, you acquire things with blood echoes, with the residual energy of the dead. In the dream, you acquire things with insight, with the accumulated weight of what you have seen and understood. The insight shop is not saying that knowledge is more valuable than blood. It is saying that they are different currencies that access different parts of the same system. That some things can only be obtained by someone who has looked at the right things. And that the looking is not free, it changes you, and what it buys is commensurate with what it costs. The Bloodborne experience on a second playthrough is fundamentally different from the first, not because the game changes, but because the player does. The item descriptions read differently when you know where they lead. The NPC dialogues have a different weight when you know which of them are doomed and which of them are deceiving you, and which of them are doing both simultaneously. The cleric beast on the bridge, which was terrifying the first time, becomes on a second playthrough a kind of marker, a timestamp, a reminder of how little you understood at this exact point in the story, and how much the game was already telling you that you were not equipped to hear. The game is designed for multiple passes. The lore is designed for multiple passes. The second playthrough is not a repetition, it is a translation. The plain doll says, when you return to the dream after the final boss, that it all feels like a distant dream. This line is doing several things simultaneously. It is acknowledging the unreality of the dream space itself. It is commenting on the player's experience of the game as a completed thing, the way a finished story recedes. It is also, if you have reached the third ending and know what the doll does in it, a moment of anticipation or premonition. A line that means something different depending on which ending you are heading toward. The doll's dialogue is the most carefully written in the game, because she is the character you spend the most time with, and every word she says has to carry the weight of the whole, while appearing to carry only the weight of the immediate moment. The choir bell, a hunter tool that heals nearby cooperators in the game's multiplayer context, is described as a prayer modelled on the choir's rituals. It produces a healing effect through sound, through a resonance with whatever it is that the choir's higher ceremonies were attempting to contact. The bell heals because it is calling on something that responds to that call, and what responds to that call is connected to the source of the blood's healing properties, which is connected to the great ones whose influence the blood carries. The most mundane cooperative mechanic in the game, helping your ally recover health, is embedded in the same theological and cosmological framework as the most transgressive experiments in the research hall. Everything in Yharnam connects to everything else. The Church built a world where there is no action, however small, that does not participate in the larger system. The final hunter you fight before reaching Yharnam, if you take the path through the orphanage and the celestial emissary in Ebrietas, is the game's way of ensuring that you have seen the full range of the Church's ambition before you face its first hunter. The orphanage, where the Church raised children for purposes that the game does not state directly but implies in every detail of the environment, is the most disturbing building in Yharnam, not because of what you fight there, but because of what it means that it existed. An institution that builds orphanages for reasons connected to its cosmic research program has moved past the stage where it recognizes the people it uses as people. The Church got there. The game shows you the building. The building is enough. Gehrman, in his final moments before the fight, is peaceful in a way that reads as resignation rather than contentment. He has been waiting for someone capable of reaching him. You have arrived. The offer he makes is genuine. He will free you from the dream, which means killing you, which means you will wake up in the waking world as an ordinary person on the morning after a night in Yharnam. And none of this will have been real in the sense that you will carry it forward. This is not nothing. The freedom he is offering is real. The dream is a prison. He knows this better than anyone. He has been in it longer than anyone. His offer is the offer of a prisoner who has found the exit and is directing you toward it, except that the exit requires your death and his continued imprisonment. And the gentleness with which he describes it tells you everything about how long he has had to make peace with that arrangement. The moon presence's appearance, when it descends after Gehrman is defeated, is one of the game's most visually alien moments. It does not look like the other great ones. It is pale and elongated, and wrong in ways that are specific and deliberate rather than generically monstrous. Its design suggests something that is made of attention, that has a form. Because having a form is useful for the particular kind of relationship it has with the dream, and with Yharnam, and with the hunters who pass through. The moon presence is not a god in the sense that demands worship. It is a manager in the sense that demands results. The hunt is its operation. Yharnam is its operator. The dream is its facility. When Yharnam is gone, it needs a replacement, and you are the most qualified candidate available, which is why it attacks you rather than negotiating. Negotiation would imply that you have options. The moon presence is not in the business of options. The third ending's final image, the small curled creature held by the doll, is the game's most ambiguous gift. You have consumed the chords. You have refused the exits. You have fought through everything the dream and the nightmare and the waking world could put between you and this moment. And what you become is small, curled, held. The size is not a diminishment. The great ones in their full form are incomprehensible. What you become is something that might be a beginning rather than an ending. Something that might grow into something that the game cannot show you, because the game ends here. The doll holds you with the care she was built to express. The night ends. Whatever you are not alone in the morning. That is what Yharnam, in all its horror and history and accumulated catastrophe, was finally able to produce. One small thing, held carefully, in the light after a very long dark. The Yharnam labyrinths are not dungeons. This is the first mistake most players make, and the one that colours every subsequent encounter with the chalice content in a way that flattens it. A dungeon is a space designed to contain. The Yharnam labyrinths were designed to connect, to serve as the nervous system of a civilization whose understanding of space and sacred geography bore no resemblance to anything the surface world produced. When the Yharnamians built downward, they were not retreating from the world above. They were approaching something they considered more real than the world above. The labyrinth is an argument, in stone and ritual and blood, that the correct direction for civilization is inward and downward, toward the source, toward the oldest contact, toward the thing beneath all things that the great ones touched first, and that human beings have been chasing the echo of ever since. The layout of the chalice dungeons, when examined across multiple runs, reveals a grammar. There are rooms that always appear in specific relationships to other rooms. There are configurations of enemy placement that repeat not randomly, but structurally, as though the labyrinth was assembled from a vocabulary of spatial phrases rather than generated arbitrarily. This is the game's procedural generation system, operating visibly, and the temptation is to write it off as technical artifact. But the Yharnam civilization's relationship to repetition and ritual suggests another reading. The recurring spatial configurations are liturgical. They are the same prayer spoken in different chambers. The Yharnamians did not vary their sacred architecture the way later civilizations varied their cathedrals. They iterated. Each repetition was a reinforcement. Each variation was a dialect. The labyrinth as a whole is a text, and the text says the same thing in as many ways as the stone could be made to say it. What the text says is approximately this: the blood is the connection is the purpose, and the purpose justifies everything the connection costs. This is not a cruel theology by the Yharnam lights. They had evidence that it worked. Their queens bore the echoes of great ones. Their civilization was built on genuine contact with something that transcended the ordinary boundaries of the physical world. The cost was simply that the contact consumed them over generations, that the blood that connected them to the great ones also changed them in ways that accumulated until the civilization could no longer sustain itself. They knew this was happening. The ritual structures of the labyrinth include what appear to be containment protocols, spaces designed to slow or manage the transformation rather than simply accelerate it. The Yharnamians were not naive. They were trying to ride something that was too large to ride, and they did it with extraordinary sophistication for longer than any comparable civilization has managed. And they failed anyway. The sophistication makes the failure more interesting, not less. The Pthumerian queens are the law's most deliberately obscured figures, and the obscurity is the point. The Pthumerian queens are the law's most deliberately obscured figures, and the obscurity is the point. They are described in terms that suggest their role was less political than biological, less about governance than about being a particular kind of vessel, a body prepared through ritual and lineage to receive something that ordinary bodies could not hold without breaking. The queen in the deepest chalice dungeon layer, Yharnam herself, carries this function as a literal condition of her existence. She is pregnant in the boss fight, not because the game is trying to disturb you with the ethics of the encounter, though it does, but because pregnancy is the queen's essential state. She is always in the process of carrying something forward. The child she shields herself with is not a weapon. It is the point of the entire civilization that produced her. Everything the Pthumerians built, every ritual, every layer of the labyrinth, every drop of blood offered in every ceremony across every generation of the civilization's long decline, was aimed at producing and sustaining exactly this, a queen who could bear something of the great ones forward. Through time. The fight against Yharnam does not offer you an alternative. You cannot reason with her. You cannot circumvent her. The game's mechanics make her death mandatory for progression, which is another way the game uses its systems to make a moral argument without stating it. You are not the hero arriving to save something. You are the latest in a long line of intrusions, a surface world creature descending into the last place this civilization's knowledge was preserved, killing its last queen, ending the chain of transmission that the entire labyrinth was built to protect. The blood echoes she drops are the residue of everything she was carrying. You absorb them. This is how the game treats the inheritance of destroyed civilizations. It becomes currency. It becomes upgrade material. The weight of what it was is present in the description text for those who read it, and absent from the mechanical experience for those who do not. Chapter 5. What Byrgenwerth actually was. The scholarly tradition that produced the Healing Church was not primarily a medical tradition. This is something the game implies through the content of the surviving scholarship, rather than stating directly. The Byrgenwerth researchers were not doctors who stumbled onto cosmic horror. They were cosmologists, philosophers of consciousness, people who had concluded that the limits of human perception were a problem to be solved rather than a condition to be accepted. The old blood was interesting to them not because it healed, but because of what the healing implied about the nature of the blood itself, what it said about the relationship between biology and whatever the Great Ones represented. Lawrence's decision to frame the blood as medicine was a translation, a rendering of one kind of inquiry into the vocabulary of another, and the translation was never complete. The medical framework that the Church built on Lawrence's foundation was always a surface over something stranger. Willem's philosophy, the one that produced his fixation on eyes and insight, was more honest about what Byrgenwerth was actually doing. He understood that the research was about perception, about the limits of what a human mind could hold, and whether those limits were biological or merely habitual. He believed they were habitual. He believed that with sufficient accumulation of the right kind of experience, the right kind of contact with the right kind of knowledge, a human mind could expand beyond its ordinary parameters and perceive things that were currently invisible to it. The Great Ones were not supernatural to Willem. They were natural in a way that human beings had not yet developed the apparatus to access. The eyes on the palm of his own hand, visible in his character model, are the physical expression of a philosophy taken to its end. He wanted more ways to see. He got them. What he saw with them left him catatonic at the edge of a lake, and the game never tells you exactly what he saw, which is the correct decision. The split between Willem and Lawrence is usually framed as a split between two methods, the mental path and the blood path. This framing is accurate, but incomplete. It misses the question of scale. Willem's approach was individual, contemplative, slow. It required patience and a willingness to accept that the transformation toward greater perception would take a lifetime and might not complete. Lawrence's approach was institutional, public, fast. It could be administered to thousands of people simultaneously. It produced visible, measurable results in the short term. The tension between them was not only philosophical. It was a tension between a research program that valued the integrity of the process and an institution that needed to grow in order to sustain itself. Institutions require growth. Growth requires results. Results require a version of the work that can be packaged and distributed. The blood could be packaged. The eye accumulation could not. Lawrence won the argument, not because he was right, but because he was scalable. The cost of scalability is always the same in Bloodborne's universe, and in the one we inhabit. When you scale something, you lose the exceptions, the edge cases, the individuals who would have responded differently under different conditions. The Byggenworth approach to insight accumulation would have produced casualties, people whose minds broke under the weight of what they were trying to hold. But it would have produced those casualties one at a time, in a context where the researchers could observe and document what went wrong, and adjust their methods accordingly. Lawrence's approach produced casualties at the scale of a city, uniformly, in a pattern that the institution had neither the will nor the ability to acknowledge as caused by its own methods. The beast plague is an iatrogenic disaster. The medicine created the disease. This is not a metaphor the game is reaching for. It is the literal mechanism of what happened to Yharnam. The beast plague is an iatrogenic disaster. The medicine created the disease. The surviving texts from Byggenworth, fragmentary as they are, suggest that some of the researchers there understood this risk before the church was founded. The debates that produced the Willem-Lawrence split were not conducted in ignorance of the blood's transformative properties. They were conducted with full awareness that the blood changed people over time, and that the direction of the change was not reliably benign. What the anti-Lawrence faction at Byggenworth could not have fully predicted was the rate of change at scale, the way that distributing the blood widely and regularly would accelerate the transformation beyond anything they had observed in controlled research contexts. But they knew the direction. They argued against it. They lost. The church was founded. Yharnam was dosed. The rate of acceleration remained invisible for long enough that the institution became too large to stop, and by the time the rate became visible, stopping it would have required admitting that everything the church had built was founded on a process that was going to produce exactly the situation you walk into on the first night. Chapter 6. The fishing hamlet as the game's moral centre. Everything the game is doing thematically converges in the fishing hamlet. This is not an overstatement. The hamlet is the place where all of the game's competing threads, the great ones, the scholarly ambition, the institutional violence, the individual conscience, the nature of coexistence versus extraction, meet and produce their clearest expression. It is also, not coincidentally, the location most associated with Maria, the character who functions as the game's closest approximation of a moral witness. The hamlet is where the game shows you what the church was, not through allegory or implication, but through the direct depiction of what it did to specific people in a specific place for specific reasons that were considered, at the time, to be scientifically justified. The great one that coexisted with the hamlet is Kos, and the nature of that coexistence is one of the law's most carefully preserved ambiguities. The hamlet did not worship Kos in the way the healing church's congregations worshipped through the blood. The relationship was more lateral, more residential. Kos was there. The hamlet was there. They had developed over time, an arrangement that worked for both of them. The Hamlet's people had contact with something vast and alien, and they had not been destroyed by it, which is almost unique in the game's history. The contact had changed them, in the ways that all contact with the Great Ones changes things, but the change had been absorbed into their culture rather than consuming it. The Kos parasite, the evidence of Kos's biological reality washing up among them, was simply part of their world. They had made a life that included it. What the church researchers saw when they arrived at the hamlet was a resource. They saw a great one in proximity to a human population that had survived the proximity, which meant the proximity was manageable, which meant it could be studied, which meant it could be extracted from. The question of what the hamlet wanted, what Kos wanted, what the equilibrium that had developed between them meant or required for its maintenance, did not enter the analysis in any way that the surviving lore records. The scholars had a framework for understanding what they were looking at. The framework was extractive. The extraction began immediately. Taking the eyes of Kos was not a casual act. The item descriptions make clear that eyes, in this game's cosmology, are not simply sensory organs. They are the locus of perception in the deepest sense the game uses that word. For a great one, whose entire mode of existence involves a kind of perception that human beings can only access partially and at great cost, the eyes are something closer to the essence. What the scholars did to Kos was not anatomical research. It was a kind of ontological violence, a removal of the thing that made Kos what Kos was. The body that washes up on the shore, which you encounter at the end of the DLC as the context for the orphan fight, is the remainder after that removal. It is a great one from whom the most essential thing has been taken. It died from what was done to it. The hamlet was destroyed in the process of maintaining access to the research site. These were considered acceptable costs. Maria's participation in the hamlet experiments is the specific horror her character is built around. She was there. She was skilled and disciplined and operating within the norms of her institution. And the institution's norms included participating in what was being done to the hamlet's people. The transformation the fishermen underwent, the marine quality of their current form, is in part the result of experiments conducted on living people who had done nothing to invite the attention of the scholars, except exist in proximity to something the scholars wanted. Maria helped. She was good at her work. At some point, she understood what her work was, and she could not continue. The burying of her weapon is the most dignified act of refusal in the game. She did not defect. She did not expose the church. She did not save anyone, because by the time she stopped, the saving that could have been done was already past. She buried her weapon in the research hall and refused to be a hunter anymore, which was the only form of refusal available to her within the situation she was in. The game honours this refusal by making her the gatekeeper of the hamlet's truth. You cannot reach the orphan without going through her. The person who refused to continue participating in the horror is positioned between you and the horror's most concentrated expression. She is not blocking you out of malice. She is a threshold, a reminder that the thing behind her costs something specific, and that passing through her to reach it should cost something too. She buried her weapon in the research hall and refused to be a hunter anymore, which was the only form of refusal available to her. The Orphan of Kos is the game's most emotionally unmediated encounter, precisely because it removes the usual narrative scaffolding. There is no questline that leads you to understand the orphan. There is no NPC who explains what you are about to do and why it might be complicated. You fight the orphan because it is in your path and it attacks you, and the game requires you to proceed. What the orphan is, what it represents, what the act of killing it means, is all available in the surrounding lore, but the game does not assemble it for you before the fight. It trusts you to carry that context into the encounter yourself, and if you do, if you have read the item descriptions and followed the quest lines and listened to what the world has been saying, the fight is unbearable in the most productive sense. You are killing something that never had a chance to be anything but what it became in the moment of its birth, which was grief-shaped and weapon-ready. And you kill it anyway, because the game has no mechanism for choosing not to. Which is also the point. Chapter 7. The internal logic of the Great Ones. The Great Ones are not a pantheon. The temptation to organise them into a hierarchy, with the moon presence at the top and the lesser entities arranged below in order of power and proximity, is understandable but misleading. What the lore actually describes is a set of individuals, or something sufficiently like individuals that the word applies, who exist in proximity to the human world for reasons that are specific to each of them, and that do not reduce to a shared agenda. Kos was present at the fishing hamlet in a way that suggests residential choice or historical accident rather than cosmic mission. Ebrietas was left behind when others of her kind departed, and the nature of that departure, who left, where they went, why she stayed, is one of the lore's largest unmarked absences. The moon presence manages the hunt from a position that suggests investment in Yharnam specifically, a specificity that the other Great Ones do not share. Rom maintains a veil, alone in a lake, with the eyes of something that was once human distributed throughout the nightmare spaces. These are not roles in a divine hierarchy. They are situations. Each of them is in a situation. The situation that defines most of the Great One's relationship with human beings is asymmetry of scale. This is not the same as indifference, though it produces effects that look like indifference from the human side. A human being encountering a Great One is encountering something whose frame of reference is so different from their own that communication in any ordinary sense is impossible. The Great Ones that have relationships with specific humans, Odon with his followers and children, the moon presence with Gehrman, Kos with the hamlet, achieve those relationships through mechanisms that are not communicative in the linguistic sense. They work through the body, through the blood, through physical transformation, through dreams, through the alteration of perception in ways that bypass language entirely. This is why Carol had to listen to a Great One and try to transcribe the sounds rather than the words. There are no words. There is something that produces effects in human consciousness when it is received, and those effects can be shaped and named by human beings after the fact. But the original transmission is pre-linguistic in a way that human beings have no native apparatus for processing. Odin is the purest expression of this asymmetry. He has no body, which in the game's cosmology means he has no fixed location, no physical vulnerability, no mechanism through which the ordinary categories of encounter apply. He exists in the same way that a sound exists, present everywhere in his domain simultaneously, without remainder, without the kind of specific location that would make him accessible to the methods the Church used to engage with other Great Ones. The choir could build an altar for Ebrietas, because Ebrietas had a body that could be positioned in relation to an altar. There is no equivalent structure available for Odin. His chapel is not his location. It is a space that his influence saturates, which is different, and the people in that space are in relationship with an influence rather than with an entity, in any sense that entity ordinarily implies. The reproduction of the Great Ones is the aspect of their existence the game treats with the most consistent horror, and the horror is not located where you might expect it. The game is not horrified by the sexuality of it, or not primarily. The horror is located in the failure rate. Great Ones lose their children, the lore says, and this loss is so consistent, so apparently inevitable, that it has shaped their entire mode of existence. The seeking of surrogates, of human children who might serve the function that their own children cannot survive occupying, is the Great One's most direct engagement with humanity, and also their most destructive. The choir's experiments, the Odin pregnancies, the cultivation of specific bloodlines through generations of managed reproduction, all of it traces back to this fact about the Great One's situation. They are trying to have something persist. They keep failing. They keep trying. The cost of the trying falls entirely on the human side of the relationship. What the moon presence wants from the hunt is, in this light, a version of the same problem approached from a different angle. The hunt produces blood echoes. Blood echoes are the residual energy of lives ended in specific ways, in a specific state of awareness, in proximity to specific kinds of Great One influence. This is not standard blood, it is processed blood. Blood that has been through the hunt's particular crucible and emerged carrying something that unprocessed blood does not carry. The moon presence cultivates this the way a farmer cultivates a specific crop, through the careful management of conditions over a long period of time, and Yharnam is the farmer's primary tool. Whether the moon presence experiences something like gratitude toward Yharnam, something like the relationship a farmer might have with a particularly good piece of land, or whether the relationship is purely instrumental on its side, is one of the questions the game deliberately leaves in the space between its stated law and what can be inferred from it. Chapter 8. The Hunters as an institution and its discontents. The hunter vocation as it exists in the game's present is the third or fourth iteration of something that began very differently and has been revised, repurposed and corrupted with each subsequent version. Yharnam's original hunters were individual practitioners operating with significant autonomy within a framework that was not yet fully codified. The workshop gave them tools and context, but the specific choices about how to hunt, whom to hunt, what counted as a beast, and what counted as a person who happened to be changing, were left to the hunters themselves. This is consistent with how early institutional frameworks operate, before the institution has accumulated enough power to enforce uniformity. The old hunters whose equipment you find scattered through the game were people who made their own calls, and their equipment reflects this: idiosyncratic, adapted, shaped by specific experience and specific choices that a more centralized system would not have permitted. The Church's absorption of the hunter vocation standardized it in ways that the law records as losses more than gains. The standardization produced hunters who were more controllable and less interesting, more reliable instruments of the Church's specific agenda, and less capable of the kind of individual moral reasoning that figures like Maria or Jura or Eileen represent. The hunters you encounter as enemies in the game, the ones who have gone mad or been corrupted or simply been abandoned by the system that trained them, are mostly products of the post-standardization era. They have the technical skills of hunters, without the individual moral frameworks that earlier training apparently provided. When those frameworks are absent, and the technical skills remain, you get exactly what the game shows you. Hunters who keep hunting past the point where hunting makes sense, because hunting is the only thing they were ever fully prepared to do. Henrik is the clearest example, because he is technically unchanged. He has not been transformed by the blood. He has not gone mad in any diagnosable sense. He is simply a hunter without a purpose. And a hunter without a purpose defaults to the only behaviour that his entire life has prepared him for. He hunts. He hunts Gascoigne's daughter's questline agent, which is you, because you exist in his vicinity and you are a thing that can be hunted. The tragedy of Henrik is not horror adjacent. It is purely human. It is the tragedy of someone who defined themselves entirely by a function and then had the function removed. The blood and the beasts and the great ones are not responsible for what Henrik is. The institution that trained him is responsible for producing a person whose entire identity was professional and then ending the profession without providing any alternative. Eileen's vocation as a hunter of hunters is the most explicit acknowledgement in the game that the institution generates its own waste. She exists to manage the hunters who can no longer be managed by the ordinary systems of the hunt. The existence of her position is an admission by someone, possibly Yharnam himself, possibly some earlier iteration of the Church, that the hunter training process reliably produces people who will eventually go wrong in ways that require specialized intervention. This is not a bug in the system. It is the system operating as designed, producing hunters who are effective tools until they are not, and then requiring a different kind of tool to deal with them when they break. Eileen is maintenance. She is the maintenance function that the Church never publicly acknowledged needing. The powder keg's expulsion, considered in this context, was not primarily about safety. It was about image control. The Church needed the hunt to look like medicine, like a service, like a managed and benign response to an unfortunate natural phenomenon. The powder keg's approach to hunting, with its industrial-scale explosives and its frank acknowledgement that the problem being addressed was too large for surgical solutions, made the institutional fiction impossible to maintain. You cannot present the hunt as a compassionate medical intervention while your hunters are detonating entire blocks of the city to deal with the concentration of beasts in them. The Church understood this. The powder kegs did not care, and the Church expelled them rather than explain to its congregation why the compassionate medical intervention required that much explosive. The powder kegs were not wrong about the scale of the problem. The Church was not wrong that their methods were incompatible with the story the Church needed to tell about itself. Both of these things are true simultaneously, and the expulsion is what happens when they cannot both be true within the same institution. Chapter 9. Blood as Memory, and the Things Memory Carries. The law's treatment of blood as a carrier of something beyond biological information is one of its most consistent and least explicated themes. It appears in the item descriptions, in the NPC dialogues, in the architecture of the chalice rituals, in the mechanics of the insight system, and in the way the game describes the beast transformation, but it is never assembled into a thesis. The game trusts the theme to accumulate through repetition, rather than requiring a moment where someone says what the blood actually is. What the blood actually is, as best the assembled lore implies, is a medium for the transmission of experience across biological boundaries. It carries the impressions of what it has been through. When it is shared between bodies, those impressions are shared too. This is why the Healing Church's blood ministration worked as medicine. It was not just delivering nutrients or hormones or anything that a purely chemical analysis would identify. It was delivering the accumulated healing experience of everything that blood had already healed. The beast transformation, in this reading, is the accumulated non-healing experience of the blood asserting itself. The old blood has been through the Thumerian civilization's entire arc of contact and decline. It has been through the scholar's experiments and the queen's rituals and the long process of the civilization's dissolution. It carries all of that. When it enters a human body and that body begins to change, the change is not random biological mutation. It is the blood's accumulated experience working on the new host, trying to produce in the new body something like what it has already produced in every other body it has passed through. The beasts are not a new thing. They are the blood repeating itself. The transformation produces creatures that resemble the things the blood has already made, because the blood's memory of those things is built into it at a level below anything the Church's medicine could address. This framing makes the Church's failure to understand the beast plague even more complete than it looks on the surface. The Church treated the plague as a disease, as a pathogen, as something external that was infecting a clean system. But the plague was the system. The medicine was the disease. The blood that healed also remembered everything it had done before healing, and the memory was older and more consistent than the healing, and it eventually reasserted itself through every body that received it long enough. The Church could not have treated its way out of this situation, because the treatment was the situation. The only exit was to stop using the blood, which would have required admitting that the Church's entire foundation was built on something that was going to destroy what it was supposed to protect, and that admission was not available to an institution of that size and that much invested continuity. The blood vials you drink in the field, as a gameplay mechanic, are doing something more specific than restoring hit points if the lore is taken seriously. You are receiving the healing experience accumulated in the blood, yes, but you are also receiving everything else the blood carries. Every blood vial is a small dose of the plague. The game does not model this as a mechanical effect, because modelling it would make the mechanic unusable. But the lore supports it, and the arc of the player character's transformation across the game, from patient to hunter to something beyond hunter, is partly a blood arc. You began the game by signing a contract to receive a blood transfusion. The thing that you are becoming by the game's end is what happened to the person who signed that contract after a full night of exactly the kind of exposure that exposure produces. You did not become what you become by fighting hard enough. You became it by receiving the blood and surviving long enough for the blood to do what the blood does. Every blood vial is a small dose of the plague. The game does not model this as a mechanical effect, because modelling it would make the mechanic unusable. Chapter 10. The Architecture of the Dream and What It Costs Yharnam. The hunter's dream is the most elaborately comfortable space in the game and the most sinister. Every element of its design is aimed at producing a specific experience in the hunters who occupy it. An experience of safety, of rest, of return. The flowers, the low light, the familiar workshop tools, the doll's consistent warmth, the absence of enemies, the gentle strangeness of a sky that is wrong but not threatening. All of this is design,